Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorinquiry, my interview series. It's more like a discussion, really, but I say interview series. That's just sort of a model people can understand. And obviously, I tend to set the table, and then the person kind of gets time to explain their thoughts, and then I bounce off it. And maybe someone thinks I had a whole path in mind, but actually, it's just being a good conversationalist. That's actually how conversations work. So my guest for this episode is going to be Yasukeh, which is actually hard even for me to say because unfortunately I've seen it written a lot of times. So even I think Yasukeh, but whatever. I've learned with Japanese vaguely names, you just have to go by the sound of it more than how it's written. And if people don't know, he is someone that I actually discovered initially through esports, which is obviously my main job and passion in life, because he's someone who was a challenger Tryndamere Mid player on the NA server. And then through that, I mean, I actually think that itself can be a starting point, right? I actually think through that, because it was like an interesting angle of like you weren't just a one trick, but you had like whole philosophy built around it, and it even seemed like it tied into things about your personality and how you view life. From that, we essentially have had some interesting conversations. So one of the people who's a member of my somewhat exclusive Discord. It's not really that exclusive. I just joke that it's like, because we do the Fight Club thing where you have to fight the first time you go in there. A lot of people get put off or beaten up and thrown out the door. So it is somewhat exclusive. Put it that way, we do try to keep like an interesting crowd there without too many idiots. Or you can be a normie, but you got to kind of be like, you've got to have a good heart. There's a few turbo normies there, but they're like almost like lovable ones, you know, like I won't mention the names, but we know who they are. Mm-hmm. They're kind of like background characters, like the drunk uncle at Christmas who you love anyway, you know, even though he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. So actually, let's start where I just said there, Yasukeh. Actually, would you draw some sort of a parallel between in a video game League of Legends, which if people don't know anything about esports, it's basically like a version of Dota, which is essentially, this is too complicated now, but if you don't know Dota, if you know StarCraft and Warcraft, imagine the really big units. Like in Warcraft, there was a big, like a hero. Basically, you just only control that. You don't have all like mini things and you control one thing. You're part of a 5-man team. Each role is totally different. In your case, people might not know, but in that game, because actually people play it mainly in a ranked mode, and there's a lot of obsession with the idea that your rank represents like how good you are at the game, how smart you are, I don't know, how successful you are or something. People actually do just view it as a status symbol, and basically they just tend to be what we call meta slaves, where they'll just play whatever everyone else is playing or whatever is strong or whatever a guide tells them to. In your case, playing Tryndamere Mid implies to me that you actually even approach League and games from something of a unique or an iconoclastic and alternate perspective. Does that somehow tie into your personality and view on life? Have I stretched the metaphor too far?
No, that's actually a perfect way of sort of explaining it, is that almost the way that I played the game was in a more not meta slave, in a very almost conspiratorial way, in that it wasn't just mid Tryndamere, but it was also the idea that I am going to consistently invade the enemy jungler as a mid laner from, level 1. Things that were not common, normal at all. You would never see anybody else. Whereas one of the best ways that you can get better is to VOD review people that play the same things that you do. I don't have that because there was not a single person in the world who played the same sort of idiosyncratic playstyle that I had. And it was always just trying to find different, unique angles. And then ultimately, the way that I played the game was just a manifestation of who I am as a personality, in that the type of ways that you ultimately, the biggest thing is that with League is that it is a way to get a sort of power fantasy in the type of thing that you like. So if you look at the kind of personality of somebody who is an enchanter support main, going to be a very particular type of person. Junglers are naturally going to be a much more aggressive, kind of in your face, willing to be able to push back on people kind of attitude. AD carries being the anime protagonists, trying to be the guys who sort of try to get everything sort of centered onto them. And ultimately, in that sense, is that the way that I played the game was definitely a reflection of who I was. And the biggest reason why I just quit is that this didn't really seem like a proper way to enforce my will upon the world. And that ultimately I don't want to be. I'm sorry?
It's a bit hollow, right? Just trying to get the higher rank or whatever.
Yeah, it's a bit hollow. And then also just ultimately with my streaming is that half the people who watched me weren't even there for the actual, high level mid Tryndamere gameplay.
Right.
Half the people were there for the kind of discussions that I have. And it's like, okay, here's a cool little play that was done. But can you get back to answering my question? That's the kind of thing, which is why I wasn't even there for the high level mid Tryndamere gameplay. I was really there as more of just almost an excuse and almost as a platform to talk about the interesting things that I was interested in. And so now actually manifesting that into reality with the podcast that I do with Starman, it's been real. It's very much about all of the things that I cared about. And now I can actually just put a 100% full focus into that. And you'll see a lot of parallels with one of the biggest things in my league career was the idea of the whole, Nice Challenger thing, where somebody was fraudulently claiming credentials that they didn't have to sort of boost their services. And at a certain point, that was a conspiracy. Like nobody in the world believed that was the case, that he was lying about his credentials. And the ways that I had to investigate that claim and really kind of shed light onto that is exactly the same thing that would be manifest into pretty much every other aspect of my life.
Okay, I'll pick up exactly where you are there. If you notice, this is actually a sort of model of gaming that I've actually applied to my own work quite heavily. And what's funny is I'm not the first person to come to this insight, but I don't think anyone else, I mean, you're maybe doing it now with parallel thinking, has ever actually expanded the model out. So when I point out to people, even top pros, have you ever noticed how actually people's character and their personality does seem to not only bleed into, but almost directly inform how they play the game? Sometimes people just think, that's one of those curious things, isn't it? And then they don't put any more thought into it. But essentially, it's one of the areas where I didn't come to that as like with every good idea. I didn't sit down one day and then just, meditate and then it just popped out of thin air into my brain. What happened was, actually in my own life, I've often told the story that in working in esports, in the early years, I was just doing normal stuff, mate. I was doing a normal interview. I try to think of interesting questions. Sure, maybe I try to ask questions other people don't. Or a classic thing I did was my research actually often wouldn't necessarily be able to play it. It would be I'd watch other interviews they did to, make a scouting report in my head or figure out what to cut them off on. That was boring when they're down that side route. Let's not ask about that. Let's go down this thing. So when I was doing those sorts of things, eventually I also thought there's sort of a cap to this. How interesting can an interview be, with just a pro player or something? And so what I realized was I have to find the models and the angles and the things from elsewhere that aren't in esports right now and sort of infuse them into esports to make it more interesting. And in doing so, actually people respond to that, and actually they can sort of essentially, one of the things, if you notice, I do on my talk shows is sort of a little breaking of the fourth wall. Is whoever's my co-host, they just start out as my interview guest, and then over time, I even will say I'm breaking the fourth wall, and I do that, and I just coach them into being able to do my style of how you have a conversation, where you do these little 5-10 minute blasts. Listen, it's always free to do a sidebar, and to do a tangent, to do something funny, because I use the system where you have a notepad, so if you have a point you make, you just write that down, you can always loop back to it, But I'm also quite good at the old orange man weave, as it's called, where you go out and then you hopefully find the thread again and dive back in and you make some funny point. So anyway, when I came to this approach, what basically happened was I obviously studied things that have nothing to do with gaming, like Joseph Campbell's concept of archetypes, or how in mythology, actually, yes, there are gods that are repeated around the world, but it's not necessarily like they were real people and that's the thing, the classic conspiracy. It's more like the idea that these are just fundamental things of reality or humans, as far as we can tell, and that they seem to manifest. I mean, a classic example for me would be, people love to use the example of the Matrix, but the area they always miss is the thing that's the most like the Matrix and does make you think there might be NPCs is when you look around the world, it's not even a very well designed RPG. There's about 10 types of people, and really you're not even shoehorning people to put them in those categories. I've even had it where I've met someone who even looked a bit like someone I knew and reminded me of someone I knew, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to try and pretend it's the person I know, and they reacted exactly the same way. So what you're saying, this is why I wondered about that question. I do feel like we all have areas where if we start to understand who we are, we will know things like how we would express ourselves, what we would choose, and stuff, which is obviously going to tie into conspiratorial aspects. So I thought the way I would open it up to you and make it just open open-ended initially, is you're also someone who seems to have a similar approach to me, which is I don't like to just go in one area and do the one thing. Essentially, I'm like you. I'm not a meta slave. I always want to know, like, within an area, what things, for example, connect or have overlap, or classic, a great one is what scales. So I notice a lot of the pillars of your life, as it were, in this model, things like health, diet, exercise, philosophy, conspiracy, research. A lot of these things do seem to have things where they clearly have overlap or techniques apply elsewhere. And in fact, maybe even there has to be parallels maybe to make it coherent. What would you say?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of jumping off points to this. Is that one is that there's so much interest that comes in from mixing multiple disciplines into each other. It's the sort of the Scott Adams approach to where you can't really be the top 10 people in the world at one particular domain. That's pretty unrealistic.
Yes.
But when you apply 3 different domains and put them together, then all of a sudden you can be the best person in the world at that particular thing. And this is also where I'm kind of, in a lot of ways, disinterested in content, because a lot of content creators, the nature of content makes it to where you want to stay in one particular niche, and it almost punishes you and downplays any sort of branching out and finding different unique angles to talk about things about. And then the people that are most interesting in sort of our esports world is, LS, in the way that he brings in all of these, Magic the Gathering or Dragon Ball Z references and then connects them into esports. These are just the much more interesting ways of finding value and unique insights when you can find the truth that is in one domain, like jujitsu, and then apply it to esports, apply it to this one little particular aspect of research, because the same truths that apply to one thing will apply to everything else. If something is true, it's just true. And it just makes it to where you're going to be a much more interesting person when you can take different areas of expertise and then find ways of connecting them, finding ways of combining them. Like, there's so many concepts that I've learned that there's insights that I would have that there's basically not a single person in the world that would be able to have that exact same thing. And that, as an example, it's I had a hip injury where I got piriformis syndrome, to where essentially there would be times to where I couldn't even limp across a room given, 30 minutes of time. I was just in horrible pain, unable to walk at certain points. And then the mechanisms of how I got out of that and all of the things that I had to learn intersects a lot with a lot of different conspiracy points, because, if you're looking at, how people move and, gait and stuff like that, there's going to be connections there and things that are insights that, nobody else is really going to be able to have.
No, I know what you mean. I would also say as well, one thing, I think this is an obvious area we can lead into now, is we might touch on some of those big sort of, categories I mentioned earlier, but I definitely agree. I think one of the main reasons as well why this myopic way where you have to just look in one area and be that guy in one area, and you just try to essentially if we want to use some gaming terminology, since everyone thinks this way anyway, you just only branch out on one skill tree, and as a result you're like a glass cannon in that one area. I notice also it seems to be really, really bad at actually safeguarding you against any of the traps in thinking or ideology or belief or getting influenced and tricked, etc., because then you just have this one very, very narrow horizontal sort of understanding or skill set. Whereas one thing I know from talking to you that is quite essential, this is why I also laid out that I feel like your philosophy, it's almost in the DNA of everything you do, is something that me and you share, is I actually really value when there's overlap, even between maybe the person themselves isn't actually overlapping into some of the spheres I'm in, but it's like there was parallel thinking. In fact, the joke is I've even listened to some of your podcasts about things we never conversed about, and I don't think you ever saw me talk about on the Discord, and you've come to similar conclusions I have by purely parallel thinking. Maybe we had similar sources, but essentially it's more like applying some sort of technique or intuitive feel for things. So I would say an interesting thing, put it this way, the really simple way to ask this question is a really insane question question that people spend their whole life thinking about, which goes, how do you know if it's real? But this is kind of, I know where you've come to the idea that things like overlap and contrast are important.
Yeah, so whenever you are looking into a sort of a new domain or looking into a new idea, somebody is bringing up something that is just completely radical and out there. A whole bunch of different things that you can do to sort of gauge the idea, because it might be difficult to fully understand every single point that comes into why somebody came to that belief. And while it can be useful to look into that, you can also look at what are other things that they believe in, what are other things that you have a strong, confident, solid foundation on, and then what are their perspectives on that? Because if somebody is parallel to your thinking in 8 things that you are very confident in, then you can take that as like, hey, maybe this person is saying something that is interesting and I might want to look more into it. But then if somebody has this potentially interesting point that you're looking into and they are completely out of sync with you on every single other issue that you hold to be true, then you can just accept that as, all right, I don't know a lot about this field, but they're probably not going to be somebody who's going to give me a lot of value.
This is one area, believe it or not, I know one thing you will have seen me say on my Discord before is I'm actually quite unique in that even though, especially within gaming and as part of my persona, I'm certainly a very critical individual. And I'm even someone where even if someone actually is a friend or someone I like, my style is I'm a bit of a jiber, I will sort of be like, I'll fuck with them a little bit, or I'll in a loving way roast them over something, like if it was Monty or Richard or something, I will say the thing where I sort of like do say a slightly mean thing, but I do it in like a way where it's like I'm being a rascal, but I'll tend to call people out. But actually I have a kind of weird philosophy that I don't ever publicly, you won't see this on Twitter, I pretty much almost never, I think I did it one time with a very famous Canadian individual who's interested in psychology, let's say, where I did it one time, and even then I like mildly regret it because I was actually just doing the current thing where I just slammed him sort of for being a hypocrite or whatever, which is like what I always tell people. The reason I don't tend to do that about people that I consider, I would never say heroes, because actually one thing I'm sure we could discuss later is I don't really believe in having like fictional people, which I think anyone you've never met and really interacted with is fictional on some level. I don't believe in them being your heroes. I think that's actually dangerous. The joke is, I do believe in truly fictional people being heroes, just archetypal representations and things we can aspire towards. But essentially, I'll give you an example. Even though at this point in time, and especially because I've been down some of these conspiratorial rabbit holes, and this what we're talking about, the fact that people will disappoint you in one area, they're legit, and then in another you're like, you bloody idiot. Well, you haven't even thought about how the same thought that drew you to the conclusion in the good area would apply here, but you just got closed off to it. And in fact, you're using all the same defense mechanisms. So I'll give you an example. There's one person, I've no doubt, a lot of people in my sphere, maybe even on my Discord, probably think I should call out. I'll just say, how I do it. I don't say it with this. Let's just say he's a guy that lives in Texas and he's pretty good at mixed martial arts, and some people would say he's funny, although that's something people diss him on, whatever. I've always thought he's funny. Basically, when this individual has his own influence on culture, one of the things I am always interested in about him particularly actually is I don't see him as some like genius intellect or like extremely, like I doubt as a child he was super intelligent or hyper rational. But one area is I know he himself actually is influenced, and said it many times on his show, by the work of Miyamoto Musashi, who says the famous quote, a bit like what you're talking about, that when you know the way broadly, you will see it in all things. And actually, it's why, no matter, even though, by the way, I actually do think this person, at this point, they're so huge, I'm pretty sure they're directly tied into psyops and fucking maybe even intelligence age, all sorts of crazy shit.
Yeah, they're part of the story.
Yeah, they are, but they seem, in fact, to me, they're almost like, here's an analogy, because everyone loves the Matrix analogy, they're almost like the fucking Cypher guy who got reinserted into the Matrix. And you know what, funnily enough, this guy does love fucking steak too. I love steak too, it's just I wouldn't eat it in the Matrix in that sense. So what I notice is, one of the reasons, first of all, I never speak against these people, is if they've brought value to my life and they did open my eyes to things, look, that's more than I've ever done to them. So I think it's kind of a bit kind of fucking obnoxious to then just be like, hey, guy, you didn't even know I existed. Fuck you. Here's a disc because you don't believe the thing I believe now, which for all I know, you might even believe in 3 years. And in fact, that's even the thing about that particular person, by the way, why I always give them a massive amount of bandwidth. Because even though I'm not like the biggest follower of their stuff, I actually generally do think in a lot of areas they have applied that philosophy. Like I do feel like even when they're caught in psyops, or let's just say maybe they contain others in psyops, I feel like generally they're sort of creeping towards truth in a lot of these areas, though. And I notice over time, part of how they even changed the story, they're not totally a Matrix agent in this regard. You know, they still have some sort of leeway or ability to move around and do things and change their mind. So one of the areas about this that I think is really interesting is I actually do think a lot of the people, to tie it back to what I said before, they're the people I have the most time for. You can be wrong in 2-3 areas. You can even be wrong in a big area. By the way, logically, I was 5 minutes before I realized something. I was 10 minutes before I even looked into the topic. I was 15 minutes as a metaphor before, when I never even considered there was something more, and I thought the mainstream thinking had it figured out, and that was the meta, and it all made sense. If anyone sort of got some of the things right, like you're saying, I'll definitely give them, first of all, an asterisk. They can get away with a little bit more. And then also, I'll forgive them. But the area, to tie it back, that I do get concerned is I know people who in their own specific vertical domain are phenomenal researchers. They've gone super deep. Some of them maybe even are charismatic and present. But then, like I say, they'll get one thing that maybe seems like it's a big thing right. But then the most disappointing thing is every other pillar in this analogy of the house just doesn't hold up. The whole thing falls in on itself.
Yeah, that's the most frustrating thing when you look at these people, in that if I were to, look into this particular researcher's perspective on all of these different things, I'd be able to reliably predict what they're going to say about X, Y, Z, yes, understand their thought processes. And then when I look at something that betrays those thought processes, then all of a sudden I just have to do a double take, and it's like, what? Why do you have this perspective on this thing? This betrays all of your other previously stated principles. And at that point, for me personally, it's just like, all right, this is not a serious individual anymore. And I don't need to necessarily, like with what you're saying, I don't need to publicly lambast them for it, but taking it from that perspective, and that there is something else that is controlling them. Not necessarily in terms of, puppet strings or something like that, but just in the idea that there is some other higher value or higher principle that is preventing them from actually being able to see this thing. There's some reason why, all right, this topic is just completely off limits for them, and they're not able to think about it in the same way that they think about everything else, which just is pretty disappointing. And it's also just something that you don't really see in person, in that it's such a drastic difference between people that do content and people that don't, which is also why I just think it's so important and so valuable to almost understand that content and looking into these researchers through a screen is almost a simulacra of the actual relationships that you can develop in person.
Yes.
In that being able to spitball off of somebody, the amount of interesting and unique connections that I've been able to make with Starman is infinitely more recently than what I've been able to get anywhere else, simply because we can be talking about topics for 2, 3, 4 hours and really get into the heart of things, and then also being able to participate in it, and also taking things to where it's in good faith in ideas, to where you'll always have the person who is, one of the concepts that we talk about is the idea is that everybody almost has like the HR lady in their brain, in their head.
Yeah, the self-censoring.
And they're almost, they're almost self-censoring themselves even when there's not that person in the room whatsoever.
Yes.
Whereas if you can take the ideas as this is a safe space to discuss these ideas, yes, and we're not going to, ruin your life based on whether or not you say the wrong thing, then that can give you so much more of a valuable space to actually be able to discuss things.
Yeah, that's actually a thing.
Whereas anybody in a content, whereas everybody in a content sphere is always aware of what is my audience going to be thinking about this.
Yes.
In that there are some people who are okay with pissing off their audience. People in this call might be those people.
Sure.
But there are other people that are like, all right, I don't want to say something that is going to make my people mad. So I'm just not going to say it.
Put it this way, what you just said at the end there, I'll just make this vague, but anyone who's in the right esports will know what I'm referring to. Let's just say I did a video this year that the joke is, if I'd have only made it 5 minutes long and just made it about a couple of big things that were like mild drama, everyone in the scene would have discussed it. I've had a million react videos. A bunch of my friends who were streamers and content creators, they all would have gone crazy on it. This would have been the drama. The joke is they all had to pretend it didn't exist, exactly for the reason you're saying, because they just knew that I was being too iconoclastic and going against the ultimate sacred cow, basically, and that if they touched that rail, I actually had found one of the rare, like, specific to esports third rails, not even just like a cultural one. I'd found one where if you touch it, they perceived it as, at least in terms of mass appeal, you die. And so I know what you mean. It's actually a thing that what you just said there is something I've also found in parallel thinking. I've had conversations one-on-one with people, we're not just talking about esports now, where I'll take people apart. Sometimes people either disagree with me or they're people that maybe I agree with, but they express things in a really strange way. And when I talk to them one-on-one, totally privately, no one's recording, sometimes they'll say things to me and I'll almost be looking around like, what's the gag? Like, is there an audience behind us or something? Like, bro, it's only me and you here. Like, you can drop that now. Like, I know you don't think that. You know I don't think that. And you know I know that you don't think that. So why are you sort of saying that? But then I know what you mean. It's like essentially they've almost trained themselves like, even when I think the thought, I assume myself, by the way, some of them think the thought in their own head and then censor themselves. And it's almost like they're thinking of, I can't ever actually be allowed to think or say that. Otherwise it might bleed out or it might sort of like overtake me or something bizarre. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's also just of the idea that you could have a room of, 10 people in whatever space that you're working in. And there could be 3 people on the same similar vibe and wavelength of you. And when you never actually say these things, you wouldn't even know that these people exist because you're self-censoring yourself and other people are self-censoring them. So you're putting yourself in a situation to where you are valuing the small, minuscule connections that will be gone very, very quickly and sacrificing the meaningful connections that you can have years later based off of that. And it's also just one of the big things that we talk about is sort of like a high risk, low risk matrix, in that this is also, it's not just something that applies to, the way that you play games or the way that you really do anything in life. High risk behaviors, high risk people are essentially high risk in every domain. And in the way that the playstyle that I had in League was very, very high risk, I'm also just a much more like high risk thinker. And a big thing that comes with that is the idea that if, I say something that is too iconoclastic, too far out there for some people, then it's going to perpetually like burn me within the eyes of those people. And sometimes these things are just aspects that you have to accept in order to actually get to the kind of relationships that you want.
Yeah, by the way, I also think that's another thing. It's something I often stress. It's why, if you notice on my Discord, since, look, for whatever reason, I try not to make it a cult of personality, but because I think it's actually largely down to this way I've developed of speaking about things where I try to sort of draw the abstract concept out and generalize it and not make it too specific to third rail topics. And I also have like a very careful way of how I describe my life philosophy. Like I really do try to do like a skin in the game approach where if I don't do it, it doesn't work for me and I don't know it's true. I don't say it. I don't just go, hey, I heard this cool thing and hey, check out this video. I didn't even fully watch it. So because of that, I've noticed I do draw a lot of people to me in that regard. And one of the things I often stress to them, because it's been so valuable in my own life, is what you just said there. It's a bit like what I tied into earlier, that even when actually someone maybe once was ahead of me on a topic, but now it feels like either I've caught up or I'm ahead, and maybe even worse in another area where I'm like, okay, well then, look, you're killing it in this area, mate. You must think this thing over here. And then they're like, oh no, that's, wow, I can't believe you're saying that, man. Like, what are you? No, I'm not associated with that. Oh, I don't know if I can. Whenever they do that, I also, like I say, if I know on some level they're legit, they're not just a total shill, they're not there to just fuck with me. In a way, they're being earnest, even if they are misguided, let's say, or maybe even compromised. I will always give them room that, like, well, look, I was maybe behind them at one point, so maybe they can catch up. Also, maybe over time, I find out, like you say, maybe that's the level my relationship is on with them. I actually think one of the main things in this area that keeps me safe, and I really worry about others, because I see a lot of people who go down these rabbit holes and a lot of the schizo posting, where it's like, bro, it's a bit like actually the occult sphere. You can go into it with great intentions and ideas and explore certain areas. But if you sort of immediately try and broadcast to everyone what it is you're interested in, what you're doing, what you seek it, you will also attract really negative elements towards yourself that you wouldn't want to be a part of. And maybe you go way too deep, way too fast. Like obviously the joke of doing something like that, it's a bit like what people do in the gym. They either don't do enough or they do way too much and then they super injure themselves, they fuck themselves up. So one of the things is I also do think that, when we have these conversations, like especially, I always say if it's family members, because let's be real, family play a much more important role than us than being our mates. In fact, I would say the psyop of the age for all social roles is that they're all your friends. It's why your boss has to pretend and use gentle parenting language like he's your friend and we're a family at this workplace. It's why among your family, notice how the modern thing is, you're supposed to be your kid's friend when they're a kid, which to me is like, well, no, you're supposed to be their parents. Like that, it's actually a different role and a different responsibility. And also, you're supposed to be their kid. Like it's actually not appropriate sometimes for you to be their friend or to be your friend. I have a similar thing, by the way, with partners. I actually think if you're going to have a long-time partner, look, you can share some of the qualities of a friend, but ideally they're your lover and your soulmate. They're not your friend. Again, friend is just something really different. So I do actually think that people miss that when it comes to people like family or close ones to us, guys, just because we've figured something out or we think we have, that's maybe even a better way to say it, we don't have to force it on them or make them come to the same conclusions or even force some sort of a, we must answer this question now before we can continue. We're not the dungeon master of their lives, you know.
Yeah, this is a big thing, is that you don't have to have everybody within your circle agree with you on every single little thing. That's almost a young man's game, is the idea of talking about whatever the new thing is to you, to everybody else. And you can really easily just understand that what also would be the value in talking to your grandma about one of the events that is super pivotal to her life and her framework and her world understanding. Maybe it didn't happen in the same way that they say that it did. Like there's absolutely zero value into that. And you're just going to fundamentally not only destroy your relationship, but also destroy like their entire worldview.
Yeah, don't blackpill grandma. Please don't do it.
Toddler a shotgun. Yeah. So in that idea is that you can be okay with, whenever they say, this thing happened in this way, you can just hold your tongue. That's perfectly okay. And that's also where it comes into the idea of having people that you can have an outlet for these ideas that is appropriate to you. In that if you do have friends that you can talk about these more out there niche ideas that are on the cutting edge of thought, then you don't have to feel the need for your own personal aggrandizement to convince your family members about that. And that's just overall going to make your relationships much more healthy when you take the relationships in the way that they're supposed to. Your wife is not supposed to be your best friend. Your mother is not supposed to be your conspiracy jumping off point to discuss these ideas with. And so taking these relationships in ways that are appropriate. And then also one thing you were talking about earlier with the idea of just a kind of an anecdote with somebody in our circles is that they had a very particular view that they expressed consistently about how family planning should work. In the to go a little bit into specifics is just the idea that, parents should be there in order to find the appropriate matches for your children way ahead of time. Like, as their babies, you should already be talking to other families in order to see, who would be a good match, because marriage isn't necessarily just between a man and woman. You're fundamentally
joining clans,
combining families. Yeah, joining clans, exactly. That's a perfect way of phrasing it. And in the kind of circles that this person was in, they became persona non grata for talking about these ideas 15 years ago.
Right.
And now everybody within those circles has the same idea that he has, but they still look at him as the crazy kooky guy.
Right.
Even though they believe the exact same things. And that's just always going to kind of happen with being on the cutting edge. It's in the more appropriate version of the idea of the Overton window, to where it's things that are within your view are the things that you can consciously like vocalize. And then when something goes out of your Overton window, you still carry the same emotional connections to the things that are outside of the Overton window where it currently is for you, but you don't remember exactly why. So in that sense, you can be like with so many other different like health topics, as an example. There are things that I was talking about 5 years ago that would make me have looked like a super crazy, wild out there person. And now you have the most sort of mainstream normie health people proselytizing the exact same ideas. And people will still look at me in the exact same way as if I was saying something super, super far out there, even though they agree with the exact same point.
Yes. I mean, there's even like a normie saying that everyone will have heard where it goes something like, it doesn't matter what you do or say, it matters how you make people feel, which I will fully admit, by the way, is probably my biggest blind spot in my actual work, because certain ideas in theory, if I wanted them to sink in more, I could certainly dress them up in a different way, tune down the aggression 17.5%, etc. But actually, as is usually my way is always the way I was through. I sort of leaned into it, crafted that to be, essentially, I'm entertaining at being crotchety too, and ranting about things and sort of alienating people. But one thing about this I want to tie into is there's two things here. One of the reasons, and I was the young man who did all these things, it definitely is a young man's game, and I was getting the high scores on it. One of the reasons why I know I used to do this as well is because since I was young and I was inexperienced, and these were actually often just cool ideas to me, not things I'd maybe actually tried in life, or I hadn't really sort of seen them from all angles and figured out the abstract generalities of them. I just saw like a specific thing that worked in a certain way that seemed right or cool. I actually did realize over time the desperation to get other people to listen and to believe and to come to the same conclusions. I even intentionally say desperation, because one of the first things I noticed was it's actually why I don't like people who, when they talk to me, constantly position themselves above me, and they sort of demand I validate. That they get to validate what is right or wrong. And I'm almost just like a lawyer in court. They're the judge. And they just keep sort of framing it as if like, well, then what about this thing here then? And when they would do that, what I noticed was even things I've actually thought about a lot that I think I'm secure about, the way I would be describing it to them, I would have a desperate tone. I would be talking really quickly, and I'd even be hurried in my breath, and I'd almost be like, I could feel like my blood pressure rising, and it's frustrating me the way this person's like, as soon as it feels like, right, I've got him to accept a bit of that, now he hops to the next topic as well. And I do feel like what these people are doing when they want to talk to everyone about the thing they learned 5 minutes ago that suddenly is the most important thing of all time, again, absolutely a blind spot of my own. I do it in esports all the time. When I come up with a brilliant idea, well, I only came up with it 5 minutes ago, but now everyone who doesn't have that idea, they're all bloody idiots and plebs and sheep and fucking hell, get on my level, even though it's like the joke is someone could have had that idea 10 minutes ago, and then I was the idiot, wasn't I? But I also do acknowledge I am an idiot in certain ways, as I think we all should. One of the reasons why I think this is interesting is when we try to validate like this, it does suggest to me that we're not secure with the idea. We don't really actually like believe it, or it isn't real to us. It isn't something that works. We don't have competence in that area. Because actually, I'll tie this into my work again. I would say, despite the blind spots and areas that the pitfalls I might fall into myself, I think one thing I've done a pretty good job with in esports is not just in interviews, but in talk shows, creating discussion spaces where I mean, we're just talking about the specifics of esports, by the way, not even controversial topics, things like things outside of the meta or unusual ideas about the history of esports or differing opinions to fans. If you notice, I will certainly in my own points, I will have a very aggressive rhetoric. I often seem like I'm not even addressing the other person. I'm addressing some mysterious fan avatar that represents what I think is the nonsense perspective or what I'm being iconoclastic against. But if you ever notice on my shows, and as long as it's a guest I invited, spoiler, those certain episodes I do in my company where I've been really rude to guests, those are the guests I didn't invite, thought maybe even shouldn't be invited. And I just realized like 20 minutes in, this person's full of shit and they're actually just like ruining the convo. And I have a very keen sense of when people are uncomfortable. The joke would be because I used to make people uncomfortable a lot when I was a young person. So now I want people to be at ease when I have a conversation. And I would actually say, I think when we talk about big topics, even though I might have what seems like a very strict white and black perspective on it, I definitely allow a lot of space for other people to have their take. And so actually in that sense, I like to give my thoughts to people, but I say it's like serving the ball over the net and see how they return it. But I definitely try not to make it that like they must agree with me or we must like come to a conclusion. There's even actually, if anyone wants to know, this is some deep law if you go back 10 years. I even once did a discussion with someone, let's say, who's extremely famous on the internet now, 4 discussions. And this was exactly the actual philosophical point we disagreed upon, which I would say is the reason why now he has very extreme opinions about certain like political topics. Basically, I tried to tell him that I think in an interview or a discussion, you should allow space where it's like, okay, we're just going to disagree on this. So let's like move to another topic or let's move the topic on. And their perspective instead was like, no, we must like stick on this point until either we agree or if we can't agree or essentially one of us cede the ground, we can't actually possibly move on. They made it sound like we were constructing philosophy from the ground up, from scratch, as it were. So I actually think this is one of the reasons why, as you're saying, it's so vital to essentially put it this way. I've got a very interesting model for you here. I don't think anyone's heard this before, which is I actually have this strange perspective I've been expressing a lot, but I tend to express it about God or family or love. And what it is it's the idea that this is actually some sort of an invisible technology of the realm that we live in. And we actually didn't create this thing. We only really gave it a name, and it does seem like it's almost fractal. It applies in all areas. So as a result, I actually do think, despite the fact I do think real world technologies can be applied often for evil, I think this sort of spiritual technology is just the way it works. And so as a result, you will see evil people use it and it'll put you off. So I'll give you a very quick model. I actually think of the people that are in my life, my tribe, as it were, first of all, like a tribe, like my inner family is closer than my extended family in the tribe. And then my neighbors are different than that. And then depending on who my neighbors are made up of, maybe they're not even particularly people I'm friendly with and talk with. Maybe they're people I do have a connection with on whatever level, kin, background, etc. And so one thing I will give people as a model is think of the classic conspiratorial rabbit hole, which is secret societies. And if you don't know, the secret society always has this very simple model, which is basically 3 concentric circles. And it goes the idea that there's an outer group of people. They're like the foundation, they're not foundation, they're the baseline level people. Some of them will only ever be on the very outskirts of the group. And they have, the most general principles, but they don't necessarily get all the secret stuff. Then there's like a group that's sort of like your inner circle, where maybe they've been initiated in some way or they've crossed a certain threshold. But then always there's a third group within that who tend to be actually the leaders, or it often works like this in cults too. They're like the even more secret one. By the way, if you're an army, this is just how WhatsApp groups work. You have the WhatsApp group with all your mates, then you have the one where you have to knock out the one that can't handle the thing you do and like can't play golf or something. Then you have the one where it's like you talk shit about the one who everyone sort of likes, but isn't everyone gets it. Well, I think I should have just used the WhatsApp group. Anyway, the point is, I actually do think of things like that in terms of different topics. And the interesting thing is, when it comes to topics, some people in one topic are in my inner circle and are in like they're like the inner heads with me. But on another topic, they're in the most outermost circle. They're the profane, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of jumping off points with that. Definitely it is a idea that wanting to, it just goes back to the point that we're talking earlier about relationships, in that you want to manage and be ultimately honest with what can I get out of this person and what can I give to this person and how do I want this relationship to be, and sticking to that, and then not taking your own sort of personal lowest emotional outbursts in terms of I really want to say this thing, or this person said something that I fundamentally disagree with, so I'm just not going to do that whatsoever. And to tie back into one of the first things that you said is that when I first did, esports podcasts with you, first off, there's this idea in that you can know something intellectually and then you can actually experience it, which goes back into, the rule that you have in the food and lifestyle channel. It's, don't recommend anything that you've never done before.
Yes.
Because you don't want to just be talking about things that you've never actually experienced. So in a similar vein is that I simultaneously I ascribe extreme agency to people that are overweight or obese in, chronic health conditions. But I also, on the other hand, ascribe zero agency to them, in that these people would never actually be in the state of health that they're in 50 years ago. They never would have been overweight or obese. And in that same sense is that I recently had some health issues that almost killed me, and I was bedridden for about 5 months. And that experience made it to where it was something that I intellectually understood, is the idea of what it means to be chronically ill. But then actually experiencing it myself gave me a much more deep and rich perspective that I can actually work off of and gain more information. And going back into your podcasts is that there's always this idea of, Thorin interrupts everybody and, he just never lets the other person speak. But then first podcast I was on with you, it was very clear that it's like, if I want to command the room, if I want to talk, you'll always let the person talk. And the times that you interrupt somebody is when they're kind of rambling off on a point that they never actually talk about and they never actually have. So it's one of those things to where once you actually experience it, it's having it to where it's actually true and understood on a more deeper level. This is why these things operate in this exact same way. And in the same sense with having podcasts and conversations with you, one of the things that I note is that, as an example, with your Charles Carroll's interviews, they are absolutely a goldmine for information in a way that not only does his solo content not really have, but also his podcasts that he has with other people. They are quote unquote like serious people, but they extract absolutely zero valuable information out of them. And so looking into a lot of the podcasts that you do on Thorinquiry, it's often the best podcast that anybody that you do has, because you're only talking with people that you have an interest in, that you have similar ideas with, that you have some kind of angle that you're looking for, and then having that conversational skill to understand, this is the way that I'm trying to talk to this person. And, maybe this person is kind of giving me, level 1 takes on a particular thing. How do I try to wean out more interesting ideas out of them? And how do I try to nudge them a little bit further? Is this something that can actually be done? And oftentimes when it is, then you'll get just absolute gold that you're never really going to get from any other interviewer.
Yes, I would even say, I'll actually tie this to the podcast that you do, the one, It's Been Real. Yeah, It's Been Real. That's the name of it. I thought it was something different for a second. Yeah, It's Been Real, the one with Starman, which is, I don't know anything about that guy outside of that podcast. I mean, I've obviously learned things about him from the podcast, since, again, you guys use like real life anecdotes, and it's clear certain aspects of your philosophy, you're quite explicit in explaining and sort of drawing. Also, another thing that I like to do as well is explain the working out. That way, even if maybe the person doesn't agree with your conclusion, or maybe the conclusion is even wrong to them, or objectively, maybe there's some value in the working out. Maybe, for example, they then see, much like in the fields of science, they then see where they could tweak and go a different route, or they bring a different part of the puzzle that shows something different. One of the things I do on my podcasts along these lines is, It's because I noticed it's the same on that show with you and him. I bet if someone watches that show and they don't know either of you, they will just think you're best friends who've been best friends for 20 years and you joined at the hip. Whereas I can tell actually that, first of all, some of it, this is also actually a secret I have for my interviews, by the way. Sometimes I do know the player, or maybe I've known them many years and I've had similar conversations privately. And what I'm doing publicly is I'm trying to help them say what I think. I mean, I'll find out in the interview that they're comfortable expressing about that, and I help them articulate themselves. And so one of the things I noticed is, first of all, you clearly, I mean, you've even said it, you have had certain conversations before, which you then sort of like decide we should do a podcast about that. But I also can tell sometimes you're also just bringing out the latest things you've got in your fishing haul, as it were, and comparing and contrasting and mulling it over. Because one thing I think is another key thing, this will maybe help some of the young guys out there, is because there's a big difference between experience and competence and like good ideas and things that seem right or maybe even are right, but we can't prove them yet. One thing we do that is really, really dangerous is words are spells. We do act like when we're just saying the idea, that's like 99% of the job done. And actually, that's why we have to battle everyone. It's like we're PvPing in fucking League of Legends when someone says something. It's like they've used an ability and I have to use the counter spell or I have to use a more powerful spell. And that's why we have to like come to some agreement. Instead, I think actually most conversation, like we were saying earlier, as long as we're not doing like a HR angle, in a way, we're collectively trying to audit and find things that are true and that work. So I always say to people, another classic thing, one of my mantras is you got to think of the improv vibe. Because if you ever watch my shows, improv is a very important part of it, because the fundamental concept in improv is don't shut the other guy down. Don't fuck him up. Don't throw him off. Don't intentionally like take what he's saying and undercut it or make it so that it seems silly. And if anything, you want to go with them
yes
to the
and
extent.
Philosophy.
Yes, exactly. That's how it's described. Yes, and I'd even say, when I notice on your show, sometimes people are floating an idea or it's something that you're currently working on, but maybe that's even what you're talking about. Maybe they give you a different perspective. Also, by the way, you'll very quickly find out, as I no doubt you have, trying to explain something, you will nearly always find out it is something, if you're not incredibly competent in that area, you actually can't explain it as well as you thought you did. You had a certainty about it that when tested and when you start explaining it, sometimes evaporates. And sometimes you even sort of like, well, shit, I'll have to get back to you on that one. Actually, I sort of didn't get beyond that after a certain question. And I'd say not only is it yes and, I would even say that another key concept is sometimes it's not either or, it's both and. I mean, put it this way, I'll give you an example in the conspiratorial world. People love, as we said at the beginning of the conversation, to have this one thing that's the ultimate truth, that everything's leading towards, the ultimate magnet or attractor for all the other conspiratorial stuff. So I'll give you an example. They'll come to, at the end, they have to have a big conclusion. By the way, I don't have that many big conclusions. I have a lot of really like foundational ones that I spring from, and I feel like I head in a direction, but the direction is very general. I very rarely come to like, and this is the ultimate truth. And so one thing I would say is, say I say something to someone like, oh, all these psyops, what are they? Well, one person's going to go, have you heard of a term called loosh? All that's happening is we're farming energy from people. And it's like, okay, I can see a bit of that. Then someone else will go, what they're doing is they're influencing you in a certain direction. They want you to think a certain way. It's like, well, I mean, almost certainly there's a truth to that, right? But at the same time, though, I mean, what does that do to the guy who thought about the loosh guy? And then another person, this is psychology. You have to understand people archetypally think certain ways. And when they interact, it's almost like playing some sort of like an auto battler type scenario. You just set those philosophies out in the world and they'll interact in a certain way, Dostoevsky novelesque, then someone else might be, well, they want to do this to commit evil. I would actually say, from looking at a lot of these areas, I think it's all of that, mate. I think it's all at the same time. In fact, I think one of the most important points, this is why I love to have conversations with like-minded people, like you're saying, is I think it's really hard to find all the angles yourself and to get all the perspectives. That is where other people and other eyes have value.
Yeah, so it's a big thing is that with what you're saying is that it can be both and, in that you might have a base assumption that two ideas are mutually exclusive. And then when you dig into them further, they're not. And they can be two ideas that are harmonious together, in that, perfect thing you can look at in, the conspiracy world is that all of those aspects and all of those angles can be true at the same time. There doesn't need to be a singular purpose behind this particular event or this particular idea. It can serve many, many masters. And in that, there's also just the idea in that making conversations so much easier. In that when I'll be talking about ideas that I'm 17% sure of and talk about them as if I'm 100% confident with them. And with that, it allows me to actually fully explore the idea as if it was true. And then once I get to the end of the golden road, if I realize that, all right, this isn't valuable, or here are the pieces where it is valuable and here are where it isn't, I can then drop it. And I don't have any emotional connection to my identity is being tied to this idea being right. As soon as you sort of take that out, it can make it be so much easier to actually parse ideas out. And in a similar way with the kind of aspect of how the conversations go is that oftentimes I'll be building up a 10-step pyramid to the point that I actually want to talk about. Because to get to that 10 steps of the pyramid, I have to explain these particular foundational points. And then if I'm talking with, somebody else, they might be very antagonistic to point 4. And then all of a sudden the entire conversation comes around justifying every single aspect of point 4. And then in that way, I'm never able to actually get to the point 10 that I wanted to talk about. So in that sense, just giving that kind of grace to the person that you're discussing with and allowing them to explore the ideas in the way that they want to, it's ultimately something to where, in the same way that, you probably want to be more social in your life.
Yeah.
You probably want to go to more events, do more things. Well, you can be the guy that is the one that gets those things happening. You can be the guy who contacts your friends and gets everybody to go to a lake day or something. You don't have to be the one who's sort of the passive angle. So in that, so many people have ideas that they want to discuss. And for the most part, most people are just going to shut them down because they don't believe things in the exact same way that they believe in. So in this sense, you can always personally be the person who allows other people to get to the 10th step of their idea. And they will give you a lot of credit for that. And you will get a lot of social value out of that. And it also goes into the idea that thinking that clout is a limited resource is a scarcity mindset. Like, you always want the people around you to be built up as much as possible, because that looks better on you. If you're constantly trying to tear people around you down in order to make yourself look better, in the long run, you're just making yourself look worse. So you want people around you to be thought of as serious people who are worth taking into account.
I would even go one step further and say I actually think this is another area that people will notice in my esports career I have done. Even when it appeared I was in areas that were like finite sum games, basically. So, for example, things like doing my job of being an analyst, for example. Why would I help build up people who are my direct competitor? Well, one of the reasons why is, like, first of all, I'll tell you a selfish reason. It will then ensure that I have competition and I have to keep my game sharp. I have to keep progressing. I have to keep doing things. Otherwise, maybe I just atrophy. Maybe I just rest on my laurels and become sort of a statue, as it were, as opposed to something fluid that can move and adapt, etc. But also, I do agree. I actually think with certain things, like, we can, since we're talking about small groups here, we can all succeed. Like, we can build each other up, we can support each other. And in doing so, by the way, I actually think that's another secret part of the technology of the universe, which is, again, we only see it when it's the evil people. And so we think, right, well, if the evil people are doing and involved with this, it must be bad. But I would just give you an analogy. Don't the evil people live in houses made of bricks too? So just, that doesn't mean get rid of the bricks of your house and live in a straw house. Like that doesn't mean that's the better technology. So what I would say is, when you look around the world, aren't all the really evil, powerful people, they have networks, don't they? Now, they're networks of power and influence and financing and things, but actually, on a very, very small level, we all need a network of power and of influence and of financing and by the way, and love and relationships. And we all need these things. So I do think actually that's also why you want these circles, and you want to sort of like allow different levels that you operate on within them. Because one thing along these lines that you would just address there is, I actually think very similarly myself. I don't really have all these ideas. I'm just good at talking about them that are 100%. I've actually got not many ideas at all that are 100%. Like a lot of them are just things I tested in real life many, many times over, or I feel like I've become very competent, and maybe they'll approach 100%. But I would say I definitely like when I take on board schizo or silly or sometimes really deep or out there ideas. I like to do, like you just said, almost give it like a percentage and think of it like either a work in progress or, maybe that's just 10% right now, but I'm not going to dismiss it, but it's also just 10%. I don't have to, in order to let it in, make it 100%. And so along those lines, obviously as usual, by the way, jump off on any of this you want, I actually did wonder, without making it like insanely specific where it's like some big issue, if someone watches that podcast, since that podcast is shared ideas and it is finding common ground and it is bringing your different perspectives at times, but then working on something together, which is the podcast, are there actually areas, because it doesn't show as much, where you are both a little bit siloed, or there are more, are there disagreements between you? Are there areas where it's just like you agree to, we'll just leave that over here for now? Do you ever do more contentious things, do you think?
So in terms of us being contentious with each other, there's, so to go into a more general point is that within that entire group, so it was me being invited by him and his family over to essentially be housed with him and to work with him for, 6 months, a couple years ago. And then again, this time, in that they were just interested in me, interested in my ideas, my framework of looking at things, and were in the, all right, we'll give you room, we'll give you board, we'll give you, work, and then get to just talk about ideas with like-minded, with him and with all of that stuff, and be able to sort of just have that kind of fellowship involved. And in that entire group, in that entire circle of everybody there, the only relationship that was actually voluntary was the relationship between me and Starman, in that every other relationship was either a consequence of living near each other, or the consequence of being in a family with each other,
right,
or in the consequence of me bringing people over into there. So in that sense, I think that this is the second most valuable type of relationship, is the one that is purely voluntary. And in that sense, we are naturally in the idea that we have different methods of coming to ideas, and that, going back to a league analogy, I'm the very high risk person who does very high risk things, whereas he is a support mate, and he's the one who's trying to sort of tie everything together, in the idea that, I am the high risk star player who's not going to be the leader. The star player is never the leader, whereas he is naturally a leader archetype. So we're drastically different people in terms of that sense, but we are very much on the same wavelength with pretty much every idea. There's not really dramatic convergence points in our thought in terms of things that can get a little bit too contentious. And then obviously the second most valuable relationship is that one that is, purely voluntary, actively sought out,
Sure.
that kind of thing. And then obviously the most valuable relationship is the one that, you guys were childhood friends together, and you guys
Sure.
built each other up to where you guys had common influences and were able to influence each other and gain a value, gain a bond that you never would be able to get later on as adults.
By the way, if people haven't noticed, this is also another example of parallel thinking. One of the reasons why, to some degree, for people to enjoy my work in the modern day, it does feel like they have to accept some element of my persona, is I actually do have a style, like you were describing earlier, that's a bit didactic. Like, I don't really just cut straight to, like, here's the juice, here's the try. I sort of go, right, here's where I started, and here's where the idea came from. Then I built on it with this. Then another thing happened. Then I added this thing over here in instead, and then it's developed in this way. Here's two examples, and then here's a higher point of synthesis. And then eventually I do get to my point. But for some of them, it's like, oh, fucking hell, why'd you go all around the houses, as we say in England? Why don't you just go straight to it? And it's like, because then it wouldn't have been anything if I'd have gone straight to the point. Like, it really would be like, I'll use the example of working out of a massive physics equation. If I just told you the number at the end, What the fuck can you do with that? Like, you might not even know what it is. Whereas if I showed you from the beginning, first of all, the number at the end doesn't even have to be something you agree is right. There might be value in the working out. And then also, if you can follow the working out, now we also think in a similar way on that topic. We haven't just agreed upon the conclusion. I feel like this is something, as an outsider, I would say that's almost a description of what that podcast is.
Yeah, so it's, when you're in school, it's always, you have to show your work. Whereas in the same idea of the young man saying, well, if I got the answer right, then what does it matter what the work was? But the work is the more important part than the actual answer itself. Because it doesn't matter what the actual answer is. It matters about the thought processes that went behind getting it. Because thought processes are something that is repeatable, and you can do that in other domains, which is just all about trying to find different value in lenses, in the same type of value that you're going to get in understanding different workout regimens is going to apply to other areas of life. And it's also in the idea that if you don't have an expertise in any topic, it can be really hard to tell whether or not somebody is trying to pull a fast one on you, trying to scam you.
Yes.
Whereas when you do gain a specialty to where there's one thing that you have a very deep vertical knowledge of, then you can understand what it is like to have a deep vertical knowledge of something. And it allows you to be able to tell whether or not somebody is a charlatan or not. Even when you don't have anything that you know about that particular subject, you can find the exact same patterns elsewhere in that you see, the statistical way that somebody fudges numbers in esports to where they're dishonestly framing the way, this team has a win percentage on T side or something, or the win rate of, this champion or this team on this map. You can look at the way that people dishonestly fudge stats there, and then you'll be able to see the exact same things in fields that you have no idea about anything related to that topic. So, that would be the point.
Put it this way, I'll give someone, again, I'll do that vague thing where if you know, if you don't worry about it. It's just general for you. So in esports, funny enough, about 10 years ago, there was an angle where you would think I was on some like Paul Atreides shit where I must have the gift of foresight, I must be prescient, because I essentially called out and took a very antagonistic approach to someone that I did consider to have, as always, not usually 100% a charlatan with nothing of value, but they took a tiny grain of value and then built up a lot of absolute nonsense bobkiss around it that just was essentially some kind of a snake oil that they were selling. And basically, if people always wondered, oh, fucking hell, you're going so hard at that person, like, that field is real. So if they didn't get it, it's because actually, even though I wasn't an expert in their area, let's just say their area was like performance and psychology, I did understand though from my own vertical understanding of certain topics, that first of all, the way that they were billing what they were doing had all the hallmarks that they were a charlatan, because they were doing the classic thing where they did promise that it was a snake oil panacea that would cure all ills, and this was the ultimate truth if you did that. That's always a massive alarm bell for me. Like, I have very few things myself that I think about that I could ever even say come approaching to that kind of level. In fact, I even think it might even be irresponsible or immoral, even if you thought that, to almost like force your opinions onto other people in that way, or demand that they follow your path, because again, it's your path, it's your ideas, and to some degree, part of your DNA is a part of expressing it and how you interact with it. But also, I can just tell you quite literally, I could get the intuitive sense that some of the even wisdoms or interesting points this person had were like genuinely, I mean, I've read some, very light books about that topic, and pretty swear some of the things they were saying would have just been the chapter heading, not even the the actual bones and the meat of the discussion. They were just given almost platitudes or very simple concepts that actually they were spinning out for people who didn't know anything about, how the magic trick's done or the sausage is made to be something really incredible. But I know what you mean. I could sort of immediately tell this is bullshit.
Yeah, and that also comes into the idea in that when you have a keen sense of intuition, you can just kind of look at that and then take the illogical, irrational intuition of judging a book by its cover, and then take that as a starting off point in order to look at things further. In that if somebody just gives you a little bit of a weird vibe, there's a reason for that. Like, it's not something that just magically
Don't you even
spawns out of
think,
the
by the
ether.
way, that actually that in itself, that phrase seems so deep, but I think that phrase is a psyop pro. Like, don't judge a book by its cover. It's like, well, we haven't got time to read all the books. Like, low key, we all judge books by their covers. Maybe not literal books, but even then, by the way, I've definitely read books that had certain covers that looked intriguing.
Yeah, and a cover is designed to advertise the book.
Yes.
And if anything, it's more relevant in actually like a person. Because, you know, the idea of having, you know, a frowny face to where it's like, oh, I promise I'm not a bad person. I just look like I'm always frowning. Like, you have laugh lines because you laugh a lot.
Sure.
The way that your face is structured is a direct consequence of the way that you live your life and the thoughts that you have. In the same idea with what you were talking about earlier, somebody that I know had a still screenshot of a video. And they wanted me to, you know, look at this, listen to this person for 10 seconds. And then it's like, who does this remind you of? Before we even got to playing the video, as soon as I saw the still screenshot image, I said exactly who that person was. And then when the video played, they spoke exactly like the person that we were referring to. And they had all of the exact same thought processes, exact same verbiage. So in that sense, the way that somebody is reflective in their outward appearance is a manifestation of who they are on the inside.
Yes.
And the idea of divorcing these two ideas is in the same idea of that, you know, that one quote is, never attribute to malice what can equally be attributed to stupidity. That idea, you know, coming from a joke book, it was never, you would never see that in the Bible. You wouldn't.
They do
even
act
see that
like it's
in,
one of the
Aesop's
10 Commandments, don't they? Yeah, true.
Yeah. Not even Aesop's fables would talk about that. That's not even a philosophy point. And the idea is that that is a saying that is very useful for malicious people to hide their maliciousness behind the idea of being stupid. And in the same way of don't judge a book by its cover is almost there to make you see a snake, see somebody that you, all of your primal instincts are telling you to avoid this person. And then, oh, just don't avoid this person. Just wait until they actually bite you, because you don't know if they're going to bite you until you're actually, you know, convulsing on the floor.
Well, it's like, I'll tell you a thing that a lot of men bristle against. I do as well, because actually, if we're talking about like zero-sum games, obviously things like objectivity and even quality and qualitative judgments do exist, and they are to some degree real. Like, there is levels of competence, there are degrees to which there are magnitudes. But a classic thing that a lot of men bristle against is when it's often women that say this. They do that thing where they go, everyone is beautiful. And immediately you want to go, well, that's bullshit. Like, first of all, your friend who's fat isn't beautiful. But I'll tell you one area in which that does have a grain of truth within it, that on some level, maybe women actually, or whoever started that saying, maybe they would get grasping at some of this, even if they then unfortunately went way too far and over-egged the pudding and applied it to everyone, which obviously clearly is not the case. Like, spoiler, some people are really horrible and evil and aren't particularly beautiful, and it even shows in their behaviour, their face, a lot of the decisions they make about how they even choose to manifest themselves to the world. I'll give you an example. One of the reasons why I actually think photo media on some level is, at a minimum, it's purely materialistically hollow beyond things like objective standards of beauty. But in real life, there is like an essence to people that cannot be communicated in a photo fully. And I'll give you an example.
Yes.
There are two types of fat people in the world. This is why I'm sort of on your vibe with the earlier thing about not being overly harsh with them, especially times when I've done a very good job with my health and exercise. It's easy to almost see them as a version of myself in the past. And I might think I'm being the guy where it's like, I'm going to give them the tough love because they need to do what I've done. But again, to tie it back in what I said earlier, who the fuck am I to tell them though? Unless they're coming at me on something of like, yeah, well, I think, unless they want to engage on that topic, I think it's insane, the idea I would just be like, right, I'm essentially going to sort of like, for their own good, like men do, hazing them. I'm going to low-key bully this person, make them feel bad, because that's going to be the slap in the face, the sharp shock, you've hit rock bottom, and then they're going to fix their life after that. Whereas I have to say, just like I know about your perspective about fat people, that if people don't know, once someone's already gotten into that condition, actually they're going to have to undo so many of their life decisions and so many steps down a path that it's actually going to take a tremendous amount of both metaphorical and literal energy, including from things like food and exercise, that it's actually going to be way harder for them to do than you. You're going to think they're at zero. They're at like minus 1,000 and they have to get back to zero first, then go to 1,000. So actually, if you aren't someone who is in the position where, I don't know, you're the stern father and they have a wonderful mother, so I don't think you're really in a position to tell that person that. If anything, you could push them deeper down. I do think in that scenario, if you're just some third party, the best thing you could do, it's actually the one area, I'll tell you what, I think this is surely a very safe person to mention. There can't be a third rail person. You know what? I actually do sort of have a level of charm for that guy on Twitter who, let's just say, he's named after a type of, what it's like to look really muscular. And his whole shit is just trying to spit positivity about gym vibes. And one thing he always stresses, and clearly seems to live himself, is the idea if you see a fat person in the gym, you don't ever snigger and go, check out the land whale, man the harpoons. You go, hey, I saw that you were working out on that machine there. And you know what? I actually was pretty bad when I started, but you look like you're making real progress. And I've seen you here each week. Like, keep going. I think actually, if you wanted to help that person, sometimes you do actually sort of incentivize them that way and you sort of give them the positive reinforcement or set an example for them. And I would actually tie in here to this idea of looking at someone. There are two types of fat people in the world, in my opinion. There's someone who made these bad choices and maybe even had like a justification initially or a bad thing that happened to them. And that what set them down that path. And when you talk to them, they really are a horrible person, and that goes hand in hand with it. But there's also a type of person where maybe actually this is just their battle where they're failing, but you actually find they're lovely people. Like they actually can be like what the traditional thing of like the jolly, I mean, a lot of these people are mothers, the ones I find very lovely, by the way. If you even meet them in real life, bro, I become like the Hallmark gift card for women. I actually see that, even though to someone else, like if this was on the internet, bro, we call like Hollywood celebrities mid. People would be destroying this person in terms of looks and then making all judgments about who they must be as a person. But I've got to say, sometimes those people, actually, it turns out maybe the one area they're failing in is their diet or their health. And actually, maybe they're wonderful elsewhere. Maybe they're even someone who just hasn't put any of their resources towards that. And they spend all their time, like if they're moms, oftentimes caring for other people and being so selfless, then actually they almost need to be a tiny bit selfish themselves to work on that area. But if anything, that even makes them somewhat more charming.
Yeah, and it goes back into the idea of when somebody might have an idea that they want to elaborate on, but nobody ever actually gives them the platform to do so. It's in the same idea with people that are very unhealthy, in that the times in which you need the most energy in order to get out of your place is the time where you have the least energy. So yes, the battle that they're going through is the most difficult battle that you possibly could envision. And so that is why it is infinitely easier, and you will give so much value to people if you are lending your energy to the other person.
Put it this way, you made me immediately think of an obvious religious example here, which is if someone is really a sinner, but a part of them wants to, come to the light, they want to do good deeds, that's not the moment to go, and now let me give you a sermon about your sin and why you're evil. That's the moment where you're like, let's pray, let me lift you up, let's find a way that you can be forgiven and granted grace.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great look at it. And it's the same thing that I experienced personally with my health condition. I just read a lot of the book of Job, because the kind of things that I was going through, I would, wake up every 5 minutes at night. I was unable to get any sleep, and I was referring to myself as the royal we, because I was disambiguating my body into multiple entities. Because I was just so delusional from lack of sleep. And in that, it's so valuable to sort of gain energy from other people. And definitely, it's why you can be that person who gives that to people. And the thing, people need themselves ultimately to be the non-critical, supportive force that ultimately has their own goodwill in mind. When they're in a position to where they can't do that for themselves, you should be that person. And in the same way that they probably don't want to talk about all of their health issues and their struggles in a public forum with all of the people that they care about, you can do that by talking with them one-on-one on something and seeing if this is something that they're actually interested in fixing.
Yes.
They just haven't had an ability to do so. Because so often, people that are overweight, are obese, they've tried multiple times to lose weight. And the standard advice that people are given from the most basic, level 0 sources that they find, just make it as hard as possible to lose weight, to where you're just essentially starving all day and you're just making it as difficult as possible, to where you are demanding the most willpower out of somebody at the time where they have the least willpower.
Put it this way, I know you've seen me before bristle when people take the idea that calories in, calorie out has zero value because it's not 100% true. I always get mad at that because I'm like, well, obviously there is like a logic to it though. And as a very, very simplistic model, it is literally correct on some level, right? Beyond things like, how do you measure a calorie and things like that. But one area I know exactly what you mean is when I myself tried to fix my diet so that I had a lifestyle that supported getting thinner and healthier and more muscular. I just tried initially doing the very basic level 101 of it's calories in, calories out. So I did the calorie counting and I was really harsh with myself and I got to the way I wanted to do. But I can tell you right now, bro, it was hell on earth. Like I actually understood how psychologically people in, fucking, let's say, restrictive prison type scenarios, they will use food as a weapon against you and they will fuck with you and they will affect you in that certain way and even psychologically impact you. Whereas what I had to learn was that is where the calories in, calories out is just level 1. Then I need to do things like, but which calories that I take in make it easier to stay within the total number? Which ones make it enjoyable to do that? That's another massive area too, because as you're saying, I could totally believe the person who's fat probably tried a million fad diets. They probably even tried just harsh calorie restriction because they heard some like Goggins' character made it work for them. But actually, I could see how that could make their life worse, mate.
Yeah, because ultimately it's setting yourself up for failure. When you have goals that are so vague and so out there and don't have actionable steps behind them, it makes it to where people are just going to give up when they feel like getting to the end goal is too impossible and there's not a strict road forward, which goes into the idea that if I'm going to be giving advice on somebody in order to get them into a healthier position, I could give them the level 10 idea of here's all of the exact things that you do. You go outside, you ground, you get red light, watch sunrise, sunset. Sure. You order your entire life around being as healthy as possible. And here's all of the very specific foods you eat. Here's the, the hormones that you take. Here's the Chinese peptides that you take.
Sure.
I could be doing all of those things, but that isn't actually going to be functional because if I give all of that, nobody is ever going to completely transform their life starting from square zero in order to getting to level 10. So when I'm giving advice to somebody just to start off with, I might just say, eat half a pound of ground beef, eat a steak, and just up your red meat intake, just as the most very basic, simple, actionable step that is something that can guarantee a win. Because the more wins beget wins, the more times in your life where you succeed in something, the more that you feel motivated to succeed in other disciplines. So you always want to have those small little baby steps that allow you to actually get somewhere further down the line, and don't take these unrealistic solutions that require resources that you don't have, because willpower is a resource. And you could try to, mental your way out of it as much as possible and just deny that that is a factor. But when you are in the most unhealthy shape possible, you need to be taking into account that, all right, I might not be able to get to the gym 4 times a week. What can I do? Maybe I'll get on a program to where it's a little bit more full body, or it's some kind of Mike Menser thing to where I'm in there for, 2 hours a week or 2 hours every 2 weeks, and something that would be much more akin to what I can realistically do given the scarce resources that I do have.
Yeah, I'll even say as well, for anyone who thinks like, why is this sidebar about being fat here? I'm not even fat. Again, I think a lot of these areas, the same concepts and techniques apply. So I'll just say this. I myself am not at some god tier level in every area. Don't know that I'm actually in any area. I find it's one of those ones where the further down the path you go, the more the path unfolds before you, and you actually have to realise like you didn't even know where the path led or who was further down it. And I will say, maybe you aren't physically fat, but maybe you are intellectually fat, spiritually fat, emotionally fat. So I'll even tie this into, by the way, if anyone wonders, like, holy fuck, there's a lot of sort of almost like epistemological stuff at the beginning of this episode. Well, yeah, to tie into what I said earlier, I do think we have to lay some of these things down at the beginning, and we'll do a bunch of psyops and fun shit later where we talk around it and you'll know what we're referring to. But I think if we just led straight into that, again, it would be like giving a toddler a shotgun, a ammo pack from Rambo, grenades, and a fucking RPG. Like, I think at that point in time, they could do so much damage. I feel it's irresponsible.
Yeah, that's a big thing that we talked about in the kind of the first 2 episodes, is sort of essentially how to not one-shot yourself. Because there are so many of these ideas that are just going to absolutely destroy you and destroy your worldview. And
you'll see victims of this all. The battlefield of ideas is littered with these people, bro.
Yeah, it's very similar to the podcast that you had with Nick Hinton recently, to where he had a really rough sort of like almost black-pilling worldview that came from looking into all of these ideas. And that is the number one thing in this world that you need to maintain is your sanity. Nothing else is sort of past that, because your sanity is the most important thing that allows everything else to sort of come from, and to have that order in your life and order in your thoughts. And so that's why, we have to spend so much time laying the groundwork before getting even to the most mild idea that is potentially a little bit too far out there. Because if you take that level 10 idea and then you take that idea as true, whereas an example take is the idea that we have is that Lord of the Rings is mid. And if we go through the 10 steps that comes to justifying that idea, then it's like, all right, okay, that can make sense.
Sure.
But if somebody just hears that level 10 idea that Lord of the Rings is mid, then all of a sudden it's like, well, Lord of the Rings is mid. Well, then I can never, write a short story that will even be like
right.
a 1/100th of that. So I'm just done. I'm never going to write again, when writing was something that was really important to me. So that's why you always have to go through the foundational steps before you go into the more abstract concepts.
Yes, it's also why, if you notice, I know I still never got around to making this video on the side channel, guys. It'll come one day. This is why, in general, I try not to promise things. But I do need to do my video on unearned wisdom, because not only did I experience it myself in some of the domains I just alluded to, the spiritual, the conspiratorial, etc., but also I did learn that when you then try to do the thing that the young man does of turn around and go, hey guys, I'm going to share the wealth. Like, here's all the fucking treasure I found. Guess what? In that analogy, some of those artifacts end up being cursed, or some of them have a power that they wield that you didn't understand, and it destroys people's lives, including your own sometimes. So that's another reason I'm also vague about certain things, as you say, as a gatekeeping mechanism, so that it keeps the right people in and they can continue on in that part of the conversation. And it just makes sure that the other people have to go through something that would allow them to enter this space. In fact, I'll actually throw this out there as a quick sidebar. One of the most insane things about spiritual and occult concepts and practices is a lot of people have just completely taken down all the Chesterton's fences around these things and destroyed all the safeguards. And they think that like everyone should do and be into these things. And even worse, they think we should mass spread them. I mean, by the way, certain psychoactive compounds, people had these crazy ideas like everyone must take them. And then also it ties into the idea that it would somehow be good if everyone was exposed. Whereas I can tell you, actually, some of the most famous parapolitical and occult practitioners, not just researchers, practitioners, people who did these things, often said, some of the very famous ones, not tell everyone this and print it far and wide. They had a perspective, whether it was like religion or that there had to be, in the old days, a structure, but it was the notion that you can't just go straight into them. Actually, in the occult world, for example, some very famous practitioners even said you should have undergone look, a lot of this is the flavour of the day, but let's just say certain techniques of examining the self or your mind, or learn things like, I mean, a very simple example would be learning like logical fallacies, etc. And that if you did these things, this would safeguard you. These would almost be tools along the way. In fact, maybe I should have used that analogy. It's actually a famous thing from the Bible. It's the idea that each of the weapons of metaphor are a different thing. One is the intellect, one is, the heart, the spirit, etc. And you need all these tools to navigate the world. Otherwise, you are just like a guy on the road who's just, you have no tools, you have nothing to do with it. And essentially, the first idea that comes along that's a lie and just kills you.
Yeah, so that goes into one idea in the kind of Twitter spheres, X spheres that we kind of partake in. I found that there was so much more value in these in, 2020, 2021, where there was just so many more interesting ideas that sort of came from it. When it was in the idea that not only we're in a sort of a losing place in the overall battle. So we got to go to, books from 200, 300 years ago and really kind of have this intellectual rigor that we're building up. And also to where, we could be censored at any point. So we have to abstract our points out in order to not say things directly, and can't just say everything out in the open as if, nothing bad is going to happen. And in that same idea with, at this point in our culture, everybody is a conspiracy theorist. Yes. And it's, my culture is not your costume. In that these ideas and these thought processes are not okay for everybody to have. And you see that these things are actively damaging people. And it makes it to where you could have the idea of, oh, everybody is interested in these ideas that I might have had, therefore this is a good thing. But there is a process that needs to be coming to wield these ideas responsibly. Whereas now in the idea to where everybody is considering a lot of ideas and everybody has sort of these thought processes without being earned, it's just being essentially thrust upon them, to where the biggest stories are all something related to conspiratorial thinking. Whereas you would never have that 10 years ago. You would never have that 15 years ago. So in that idea, it's making it to where this is just a really rough thing to have to take into account and deal with. Because if you were to talk about conspiratorial things as an example with somebody who is almost like a more blank slate on the topic, then you can deal with things in a certain way. To whereas when somebody has all of these ideas already set up, you almost have to like tear things down before you build them up. And it makes it infinitely harder to actually manage and get these ideas out there to people in ways that are actually useful for them. And just makes it much more difficult to sort of traverse the terrain.
Yeah, I'll even give what I think is an example of that, which is on the idea of getting one shot by ideas that you just don't have any of the tools to equip you to deal with, examine, like safeguard you against certain components, and it just runs ravage over you and destroys you. Let's just say there was a very famous sort of movement of conspiratorial thinking that clearly it's a lot of Americans, one-shotted a lot of American boomers. And as a result, people, I mean, I would even say this is part of the reason why these things were propagated by the people who propagated them. It then made the entire area and every single facet of the things these boomers were discussing become not just the object of derision, but outright reviled. And in fact, it can even ruin your life if you're at all associated with that. In fact, people will label you as being someone who thinks in that particular way, even though if you ever examine it beyond the psyop elements and sort of the theatre of it all and the parts where, let's just say they don't know where something's being exaggerated or something's being built up in a way that takes because I always think the best lie doesn't even just contain a grain of truth. It contains a decent amount of truth. It's just then you shape it to a certain end, and by the way, you almost always add in a poison or a booby trap at the end. And so that particular thing, there was a lot of areas in that thing that say the way that society cares for the young, or how we structure society and how people maybe move up and down within these spaces, or the concept of if someone would come and save you. A lot of these things were basically weaponized and made booby-trapped. And then essentially, it's like society did what you said earlier. Instead of just the young man going, hey, grandma, you know those 3 pivotal events of your life when you were young? Here's why they're all fake and they didn't happen. And the devil's out to get you. In the same way as that could actually just like ruin her life. She's never going to go and read the book that would help her deal with that or be able to take it on. But I think this whole area, I know what you mean. And so actually this ties into something else I want to discuss, and then we'll get into the fun aspects where there's a bit of juice for people. So one other thing I try to do, and what's funny is a lot of my ideas all start intuitively. That's the area where I think, look, people in history would call it genius or whatever. I think it's just like there is something inside you. I don't know if it's an imaginal realm, if it comes out the DNA, if it comes from the blood itself and who you are. But there is something, there's like a spark of an idea. And then the rest of it, I tend to find through techniques, observation, comparison, contrast, research, dissection, as you just said. And so one thing I've been able to, in hindsight, view my own life through. Also, if you notice, I love the idea of models or lenses. And again, it's a both and, it's not an either or. One of the ones I love is I do think that in the same way as you described earlier, like another young man's mistake is, it's also propagated in society, is I'm an individual, I am an island, I don't need anyone else. That's what my strength is, I don't need anyone else, and I can succeed in all regards. By the way, a lot of young women falling for that psyop at the moment, and it's destroying them. I always tell people, another part of the spiritual framework or technology of the universe I feel like I've uncovered is this idea that a lot of relationships are modeled like families because we all need certain familial relationships, whether we had them in our lives or not, and particularly if we didn't. So in the same way as people will say, now here's as usual how the psyop is, they'll portray this to you, but in the most fucked way that gives you no value. So they'll say, you can just make your own family, right? Be careful with that if you currently have a family, because now you're almost going to be idolatrous towards your real family and put an undue status on people who won't even have certain reasons to be loyal to you or to be honest to you and to create sort of a safe area, like you said. But I will say, I'll give you an example, right? And the most obvious one for people is if a couple gets together, well, because in nearly all of human history, a couple gets together and there didn't used to be sexual protection, inevitably, if they are fertile, eventually a child would be sired. And that was part of then the family unit expands. And then they pour the love not only into each other, but then they give it to the child. People will be able to see, I'm pretty sure it's not a unique observation, that a lot of modern couples who don't have children just do that with a pet. And they elevate the pet to the status of the child. They pour out the love into it, which certainly fulfills some of the function within them of needing to give love. Look, they will be frustrated. They'll never get certain things back. And they might even, as a result, maybe undervalue the experience of having a human child. But also, if you ever go and see someone who has a big family, including a lot of children, you will think you've gone back time 60 years. Their dog is just a dog, mate. Like, they might be nice to it. They might scratch it on the ears. They might walk it. They might like it. They don't, it's not on the softest pillow. It's not little Mr. Shookums. It's not like treated like a child that can't talk. And so I actually think there's a healthy way you can apply the family dynamic. And it goes like this. I do with a lot of my male relationships, unless they're just people I intellectually share things with, a lot of people I noticed I did. And by the way, my realization for this, you'll immediately recognize when I tell you, was when I went and lived in South Korea. Because in South Korea, they even model friendships along this strict notion of older and younger brother. And the notion is, even when we're friends, if I'm older than you, they just do it strictly based on age. If I'm older than you, I have this I not only get to in a way instruct you and be a little bit in charge, I also actually have a care of responsibility for you. I'm supposed to take care of you. In the same way, if I'm the younger brother, as much as I have to respect and revere you, I also can expect to receive protection or gain things from you or get help, etc. And so first of all, I noticed a lot of my relationships, I was either a younger or older brother. Like, I'll give you an example. I'll give a specific example because people will know this case. In esports, you'll even see it if you ever see how we talk. Not only is he a couple of years older than me, but Richard Lewis is like my older brother. Now, he isn't. That's not a literal family relationship, and we don't go beyond certain aspects, but that's kind of how our relationship is modelled. And so, to some degree, I always give him extra bandwidth for things I don't know about, etc. Also, you might notice he can be somewhat more forgiving of, say, some of my foibles or failings than other people might be who just view us as pure one-to-one equals, etc. Similarly, there are people where, because, let's say, maybe I don't have certain familial elements myself, there are people who, it wasn't younger or older, but sometimes I did treat them like a son, especially if they were ones that I took close to me and I tried to help instruct or lead the way with. Maybe I would say a mentor relationship can be like this. I'll even say, this is why I even adopted this terminology, mate. When I talk about the community and I even seem like I'm being rude or aggressive, beyond the ones that I actually think are horrible and evil and they are just my enemy, I literally call them my nephews. I act as though I'm in that scenario the uncle who the nephew's acting up, and I'm not the loving dad. I'm maybe the guy who's going to be a bit instructive, or I'm going to sort of like dare them to actually prove that they're not just a young man spitting game. They can do this. I don't know what you think about this topic, but I found this model actually very interesting and useful, especially because it's made me realize in hindsight that just as I'm always telling people, it's been one of my things for the last year or two, that you can say you don't believe in God and you don't need God, but just give me 10 minutes and a few honest answers from you, and I'll tell you what is God in your life, what you've filled the whole of God in your life with, and what your religion is.
Yeah, so this goes into a very general point of what we're talking about with structure that applies to both any time that you're trying to wield an idea, you need to have the structure that is there to support it. That same thing goes for your life in the same way that an example that I'd give is, Super Nintendo music. When you had the ability to only play, 5 tones at a time, you had strict limitations that you had to work through. And that led to much more interesting music because you had to be able to focus on having a catchy melody more. Whereas you look at, modern Avengers music and you're not going to find a single track despite having so much value, money, and unlimited resources and limited potential to work through. So in that sense, having that structure also demands having limitations, because when you're in a family, you can't live your life in a certain particular way. If you're, an amateur caster, like Starman used to be, he used to do like tier 2 casting for amateur League of Legends. If he got, an offer from LEC or something, like he would have to completely upend his life and move away from his family and not have any of that structure anymore whatsoever. So in that sense, regardless of whether or not he would have wanted to take that option, he doesn't have to think about it at all because he doesn't have that option anymore, because the fundamental, most important thing to him is his family structure. And that we're all going to work through things together and we're all going to build each other up and we're always going to be there for each other. And that limitation is what allows you to actually be able to create something of significantly more value. Whereas now in the modern age, people around my age, like, never really got any sort of instruction from our parents as a general carte blanche thing, to where it's, you can be whatever you want to be, do whatever you want to do. Right? Yeah, non-judgmental. And it's just the idea of you can do anything and, we're going to support you through anything. Whereas you'll see a whole bunch of people say that, all right, I'm directly asking my parents, what should I do with my life? Give me direction, give me structure.
Yes.
And then it's just impossible to get that. So what that comes into is that not only do people my age have to actually actualize what they want out of their life, but now they have the extra goal that they've not really had at any other point in time of having to figure out what are the goals, what are the values that we're actually trying to share, and what are we trying to build up. Having to work through things from scratch is a very kind of foreign place to be. And you can solve that, not in your own life necessarily, but you can solve that in the next generation by giving that family structure over to you. And that, I'm already thinking about, what are potential families that my future children can marry into, so that they don't have to deal with that. Like, what can I do to sort of give them, options for work. That, okay, here's, these families that run these businesses. Here's these skills that can be taught. So you don't have to think about, what you're going to do for work. You don't have to think about who you're going to marry. You already have all of these options sort of like set for you. And here's the way that our family does things. Here's the way that we structure things. And here are the roles that you get to play. And you get to actually be a child instead of having to be, the 18-year-old who has no direction, just randomly going off to college and trying to figure out from create your own first principles into how you want to actually structure your life. Like, that's a really difficult position to put yourself in. And there's a very small amount of people that can actually succeed in that. Whereas the types of skill sets that it would require, as an example on a health aspect, is that to be healthy, you almost have to have a conspiratorial mindset.
Yes.
In that the prescriptions of health that you're given by the authority structures are not going to make you healthy. So you have to be somebody who is inherently skeptical of authority and willing to actually enact that into the world. And that makes it into a situation to where no society would operate if everybody was anti-authoritarian. No society would operate if everybody was skeptical of authority. It is always only supposed to be a small minority of people who are willing to do that. In that, this is where it would go into the farming analogy in the sort of high, medium, low risk matrix. And then you could think of anti-authoritarianism as being high risk, in that you're just trying to have to find your own way. In a farming community, the low risk individual is going to be somebody who is just farming the plot of land that they already have. The medium risk individual is going to farm the plot of land that they have, and they're going to expand out a little bit further. And the high risk individual is going to be the guys who go out in the middle of the winter, build a cabin 5-10 miles away from everybody else, and try to build a completely new plot of land. They might not live, but they might give you a massive resource that you have of this completely new plot of land that can be developed and you can flourish on. And society would not work if everybody was high risk. Then you have no baseline to work off of in order to structure yourself. So in that sense, it's just very difficult for people in the modern age, in that it requires tools that only a small minority of people have in order to actually work around the kind of issues that people have these days.
Okay, we're actually going to go through the family thing into the psyops. I've got an answer to that, which is, it's also why I think so much of, especially, let's say, media programming has been this idea that not only do we all have to be friends and gentle parent each other, but that we're all individuals with identical rights and levels of respect, and we could all be equally right, and there is no objective basis to truth. And one of the areas this manifests in parenting is, like you say, there was a generation, and by the way, I have come to that conclusion, that in general, I mean, maybe I'm very lucky in this sense, I don't think that a lot of the parents I've known and a lot of the elderly family figures were malevolent. I think they were mainly misguided, or they were overcompensating the other way for things that happened to them. And so they made mistakes where, essentially, in the analogy of the Chesterton's fence, they ripped down a bunch of fences because they were overly restricted. And they took the idea that restriction is always evil or is always bad, whereas actually restriction is the founding block of order. It's how we divide things. Mm-hmm. It's how we actually select the things that are good. Like, I'll give you an obvious example. If people love to say that line, well, you know, that group's not so bad. It's just a few bad apples. And I always go, why do you use that metaphor? Because actually, when you have bad apples, quite literally, and you put them in with good apples, soon you just have a lot of bad apples. Like, actually, in the field of apple picking and storage, we've actually figured out an objective truth, which is you must separate bad apples out. Actually, that's really important to me. Otherwise, there is no such thing as a good apple. Now, maybe you could say, maybe the modern thinking is, who is to say what is a good apple? Which is just, listen, that's the devil in your ear. If that was a tweet, I would quote tweet it with the devil with a speech bubble going down onto the quote tweet there. That's what the gin in your ear would say. So one thing I would say about parents is this whole thing of don't be judgmental tends to be from the fact that when they were young, they felt overly judged, or that authority was overly harsh or malevolent in its nature. I mean, a lot of people actually do. If you notice in the conspiratorial and even the sort of psychedelic spaces, there is this notion that we're supposed to almost be on some Buddhist, like we're all one and we're all just all fuzzy in love and it's all good. And we can just, if we just give everyone love and embrace them all, then they will mirror it back to us. And any kind of structure or a division or protection is actually always authoritarian and heavy handed. And I actually, even though I think they're not coming from a bad place when they try to enforce that, they're actually trying to sort of free you from what they perceive to be their prison. I do think actually that then that goes the other way around. And in the analogy of having no fences, that's like you lived on a farm where things were horrible and authoritarian and destructive. So you just took all the fences down. You got rid of the gun that you had, because actually, maybe in this analogy, your dad, the farmer, he was a really mean guy, and he seemed to take relish in using that gun on people that you thought were good. So you think, right, no guns, no fences. And now when your kids go out in the field, a wolf just comes in, a coyote just comes, he kills them. Foreigners, outsiders rather, just invade your land, take over. I think actually, even though it's one of those things that's a good intention, there's a reason why I think, unfortunately, people sort of like overcorrect. And I do certainly think it was like societally influenced and propagated.
Yeah, because the kind of problems that they had are not related to the problems that we have as people my age in the modern day.
Yes.
And yeah, like with what you're saying, they're trying to correct for the issues that they had. And they had a fundamentally different landscape. Like you'll always hear the kind of boomer idea of, oh, just go up to a job and shake somebody's hand with a firm handshake, and that's how you get a job.
Yes.
Whereas one of my good friends who's been a really high influence on me, he's probably like top 10 programmers in the country in terms of very, very competent. Everywhere that he goes, just does immense, really, really high quality work. Very good interviewer, has very high quality skills. And even him at the peak, the echelon of what it would be to be competent, even he has like really, really difficult times in terms of, you know, how much he actually has to apply in order to look for a different position. So that the job market is completely different now compared to what it was then. And the kind of advice doesn't work for that sense. And when you have an idea to where, you know, wealth creation was something that was incredibly easy to do, you know, 50 years ago, where you could work a normal job and get multiple houses and build this unbelievable amount of wealth that nobody ever really would in any other point in history, makes it to where not only is it something that it makes it to where it's harder for you to understand the outside perspective, but it also comes into the idea that in order to actually sympathize and understand the issues that people would go through today would be almost counteractive to the positions that sort of enforce their own positions in the sort of the economic hierarchy, or however you would say it. And yeah, with what you're saying of there being just different challenges that they face and different issues that they have, and then trying to apply them elsewhere, definitely does make it to where it's Starman's wife had this almost a counter signal, but just of this genuine kind of question of, hey, shouldn't this like podcast that you guys are doing, why isn't it like old people doing this? Like, you know, it's two guys, it's two guys smoking a pipe and, you know, giving advice on this kind of stuff. Whereas these should be the roles that are taken by older folks. But it's of the idea, like, this is a big thing with, you know, public schooling as an example, is that it does separate people into generations to where you don't have the, like, biblically, you are commanded to teach your children. And when you have this kind of separation to where you're being taught by Babylon, you're being taught by the world, it makes it to where people don't really understand previous or future generations, to where there is that separation to where grandkids don't even speak the same language as their grandparents. And there's no real way of connecting these things. And it only takes a single generation of a break in order to completely destroy the system. like a community can exist for 300 years, and as soon as you have a single generation to where rules, order, consistency, the Chesterton fences are not enforced, then all of a sudden you have to build those things back up from scratch. And then you don't have any parallels, any ideas of where you can look to those things from the outside in order to understand it in the here and now and what you should do.
Right. One thing I think that would be fun is we'll even be a tiny bit didactic about psyops as we talk about a few now. So I've got an angle for you that I'm going to relate to games. I'll even use like a League of Legends example, or you can use, it applies to a lot of games. You could do it to StarCraft 2. In fact, I can even give a quick, as I always am want to do, I'll give a couple of sports analogies, and it's all essentially talking around and about the same thing. So one of the most interesting things that you said earlier is because people tend to do either or black and white thinking, it means that then, for example, when something that they thought before becomes popularized, that must mean it was totally right and like everything about it was justified, or now maybe, you know, it's broken out of containment and suddenly it's free in the world. And what they never ever seem to acknowledge is that the people who play the game of shaping society in our minds and reality, let's say, clearly do have like the ability to think more than just first order effects. They are chess players. They don't just do things. I mean, by the way, this is even literally built into the concept of the Hegelian dialectic, which even though people say they understand, no one ever bloody applies. They always just go, well, here's my thesis and you have the antithesis. And it's like, yes, and what is the synthesis? And is it possible that the person who did the antithesis to your thesis actually wanted the end result of the synthesis? So you think you've transcended it and come to a conclusion that makes what they said not complete, but actually they've led you down a path where then you take the last step. So I'll use the concept of, in League of Legends, if you're in a team fight or even in lane, there's the idea of zoning the person off. Like what you tend to do is you posture and you behave aggressively, or you threaten in a certain way that makes that person just not even want to choose to step towards that area that for whatever reason you want to control or contains a resource or whatever. Now, an obvious example of that in the PSYOP world would be third rail topics. As soon as you, or actually I've noticed on your show, I think you're totally right. Most of the time it's never even us that had this. It's actually that we see a public figure that we assume isn't part of the WWE. He's just a real wrestler that's out there in the ring trying to do his best. We see them get burned by the third rail, get electrocuted, and we go, tell you what, I'm going to be like one of those babies or dogs where, you know, they show the thing where they slap the dad and then the baby just eats the food then because he's like, well, shit, I don't want to get slapped for not eating the food. It's like that. Then there's also the angle. So that's how they keep you away from certain topics. Then another one for me, it's another fundamental concept from these games, would be to reposition someone to where you want them to be, but by just moving them away from another area. So the example here would be, if you have certain abilities in a game, so in a game of League of Legends, for example, if in a team fight, the other team had two powerful ultimates and you know one of them is going to go down into one area, I actually think if anyone wants to get, I'll actually give a literal example, even though it's way too nerdy for people who don't follow League of Legends, but if you do, you'll get what I mean. One of the reasons why I was a big fan of the Chinese LPL team, JDG, when they had the Chinese mid laner Knight and the Korean AD carry ruler, who, by the way, I find it almost impossible the ruler could have been like super fluent in Mandarin, maybe he knew some. They almost had an intuitive sense of how to play out a team fight, because what would happen basically was, because people were so scared that if they got into a certain range against ruler, that he would like carry the team fight against them, it meant that if you were Knight, you just watched where they were going to move away from, and now you could do your maximum damage and you could be the most effective, and there was like a dynamic playing out in that way. So if people want a sports analogy, in the NBA when you're playing team defense, not one-on-one man defense, maybe you use the one-on-one man defense to just funnel someone a certain way. It's actually what the famous team, the Detroit Pistons, did against Michael Jordan. You funnel them a certain way where then a powerful defensive concept like a shot blocker or a help man that's then going to stop them outright accomplishing their goal that you couldn't have done on its own. In the NFL, the example would again be like if you're doing man coverage on someone, you just take away a certain side of the field, so then they have to run inside. So then the same analogy, like the linebacker clears them out or blocks them, etc. I think one thing people don't understand about psyops is. It's not simply just you can't talk about this or right, you can talk about this. It's more like there can be a benefit to you talking or thinking about something, even if counterintuitively it contains truth or revelation. I feel like this is a topic that's dear to your heart.
Yeah, this is a really big concept in that there are certain first off, there's this idea that people will always have, especially in sort of conspiratorial minded circles, that applies exactly directly to this, in that they'll have this idea and it's like, oh, no sources confirm it, and it's just this super big conspiracy thing. And they have an innate skepticism of science, media, academia, etc. And then as soon as it's said by those sources, it's like, well, even, this
yes.
source, like, even they say it now. But the problem is that if you are skeptical of media and you understand the apparatus that works for ideas that you don't like, you should have the most skepticism towards the ideas that appeal to you, not the least skepticism. So if they're talking about something in a way that appeals to you, you should be questioning, like, all right, why if all of a sudden this is a topic that's okay to talk about? And a big problem for me is in the general idea of, there'll be some really far out there conspiracy, and then all of a sudden some big influencer talks about it, and it becomes like one of the biggest stories that sort of exists. And now all of a sudden, like, I no longer have controlling of the framing, because before, if I wanted to discuss that topic with somebody, it was something that I could build the structure from the ground up. Whereas now, whenever that idea is brought up, it's like, oh, so that's idea that so-and-so said. And then all of a sudden, like, that is poisoning the well, not only for them, but also in terms of the way that sort of I could broach or I could discuss the topic. And what happens is that people naturally will, even if they have a skepticism towards authority and skepticism towards these sources, there's still ultimately an idea of almost trying to seek validation out of them, which, if you don't like these sources, then it shouldn't matter whether or not they agree with the things that you say or not. They either are a source that you care about or they're not a source that you care about. So that just makes it really almost like frustrating in the idea of I don't like it. And I don't think that it is a value when the sources, the mainstream sources, agree with a point that I have, because they're always structuring it in a way that I wouldn't. And
yes.
They structure it in a way that is putting in these ideas that are absolutely not true whatsoever. And then now, whenever anybody thinks about this idea, they're going to be thinking about it in the framework that has already been given to them. So if you ever have an idea, the worst thing that could possibly happen to your, pet conspiracy or whatever is it being talked about by these mainstream sources
yes.
and being normalized, because that's happening in a very specific framework that is counteractive to the fundamental goal and like the logical conclusions of it. Because with so many different conspiracies, there is all right, this is true. What are the logical conclusions? What are the
yes.
outcomes of this? So without getting into a specific example, one of the biggest like kind of conspiracies and kind of things that people talk about is really the idea that we operate under a blackmail economy.
Yes.
In that, people that are really high up there in so-and-so levels of power, they get into a position, and then they get into a position of power, and then they get blackmailed to where all of a sudden they have to do whatever these people say, or else they're going to lose their power. And this is something that a lot of people get into, but the inherent implication of a blackmail structure is that there is a need for a blackmail structure, which implies that it is able for people to get into the highest positions of power. Somebody can become a Taylor Swift while being a perfectly normal, authentic individual. And then all of a sudden they are being blackmailed later on, once they already have the success, in order to follow whatever
so puts the cart before the horse, right?
Yeah, whatever Babylon wants. Whereas, if anything, this legitimizes the system.
Yes.
This doesn't delegitimize it, because it implies that there is the possibility of a white hat even existing. It implies that, if somebody wasn't part of this blackmail scheme, if they weren't part of this system, then all of a sudden they could be a totally legitimate, authentic individual.
And it makes it sound like they only, the people participating only did it begrudgingly. So all of a sudden it's like, well, who's even the evil people here, you know?
Yeah. And kind of the biggest thing with that is that if you are in that position of being blackmailed, you're functionally acting like a spy.
Yes.
And it doesn't make logical sense, if you think about it, to take these, just an example of like Lil Wayne. Do you think that Lil Wayne would be competent enough to be a spy who would be able to keep these things secret?
Sure.
Whereas the competency in the world where there is a larger conspiracy network, it wouldn't be able to have something to where you could just randomly initiate anybody into it and all of a sudden they'll be the most competent, perfect spy ever. So that's where the kind of frustration comes along with the idea of all of these conspiracies being legitimized and brought out there, is that the framework of these large conspiracies completely detracts from the positive lessons that would otherwise be gotten if you could work things from the ground up yourself. There's always some kind of poisoned idea, and the logical conclusions that come out of these mainstreamed conspiracy theories are always pointing you towards the wrong direction. They're not giving you some sort of valuable insight that you can take and enrich your life, really.
Yeah, I'll actually use what, again, I think is a safe example, because I feel like in general, if you talk about things, one of the reasons I love to reference Tolkien or C.S. Lewis is they're considered kids' books and people think of them as they're just fantasy, and it makes it really safe to discuss big ideas. Also why I love Dune, etc., about political intrigue and how power is wielded, etc. And I also do think, especially in the case of things like Dune, when you actually hit sort of archetypal or objective truth, it actually even isn't totally just expressed through the vessel. Like some of it even escapes through the cracks, and the author themselves might think one thing or the other, but maybe that's not actually what they expressed or what the people take away from it. So along those lines, you will see a classic example of cyclical conspiratorial thinking is the modern day notion that since Tolkien himself said, which he never even said this, people just took the concept from one of his books and made the quote way better. But by the way, that's actually how all great quotes work, has been my conclusion from studying history. There's this thing where they took the idea that 'cause Morgoth took like, I don't know, like fucking elves and made them into orcs or some shit like that. It's the notion that like, evil just takes good and then perverts it because it can't create itself, which I do think there's a fundamental truth to. But what's funny is that is then applied to, let's just say, what's the Tolkien equivalent of the prequel movies in Star Wars, if you get my drift. And basically people will go, see, they took it and poisoned it. And basically, if I tie it back into what you're saying, the reason why it sets off an alarm bell or it waves a red flag for me when mainstream media starts talking about something and almost saying, wink, wink, well, I guess after all, the conspiracy theorists were right about this one, Dan. Yes, Mord 11. They were probably right about other things. Whatever will they think up next? The reason why that sets off alarm bells to me is that's actually, in my opinion, like a regime signal. Like, right, this thing's been contained. We've alchemically transmuted it into pure evil and it's poisoned and tainted. So it's now okay for all agents within the system to distribute, propagate and allow this out. Whereas before you were supposed to suppress it, ignore it and say it was wrong. Like, I think that's the part that people miss. So the joke is, even the movies of Lord of the Rings, which people would go, well, the Lord of the Rings movies are incredible, but it's just this like prequels movie that they really fucked it. No. What you're missing is, first of all, if you actually know the source material, the Lord of the Rings movies, like every single Hollywood production, have already been through a ringer, mate, of changing ideas. Now, look, they will always, in every creative field, you'll find this, because it's a both and, they'll always have a reason they did it that wasn't wasn't conspiratorial. It'll be like, well, I had to cut down this character and combine two characters. Well, we just didn't have time to film this specific scene. By the way, ask yourself in Lord of the Rings, if you read the books, what the most famous scene people say is missing from even the extended editions. They put it as sort of a scene of like what could have happened. What that scene, if you love C.S. Lewis and the idea you apply it to real life, that's Tolkien's version of a prescient view of today's climate. But there's a reason that was never included in the movies, mate. Because that idea, they haven't figured out how to contain that. They haven't warped that one yet. So that one got onto the cutting room floor, even though I've no doubt Peter Jackson would say some directorial reason or some storyboard reason why he couldn't put that in. But essentially, to me, the red flag is, bro, they made hundreds of millions of dollar movies about these topics, put them in cinemas, advertised it to us, and then used culture to get us all to watch these movies. They weren't doing that going, shit, I sure hope these movies you said are good, Bill, from that kid's book, don't have like straight fire ideas in that fucking psy up everyone and make everyone wreck us. Oh shit, they do. What are we doing? Oh, well, I guess 20 years later, we better make like a shit prequel. That'll fix it. Like essentially, the second they started making the original movies, there was a component of shifting this, whether that be high up production levels. People always forget there are producers on these films. No one knows what role some of them play. Some of them were directors themselves. Sometimes they seem like they did nothing. Sometimes they seem like that was their film, even if there was a director. So we ignore these aspects. But I think if you look even at the film aspect of this, you already see that like the second it gets through to the mainstream, and this will tie later on to some advice I have for people, as soon as it gets through to the mainstream, it had to have been compromised. It had to have passed certain thresholds. It had to be made safe for them and maybe dangerous for us.
Yeah, this is where it's the idea that, oh, these things can be truths that, oh, it's just too true that they just can't hide it. Like the framework that they're always putting things in is always sort of planned from the start.
Yes.
And also an additional factor is the whole idea of, tacit consent, of the idea that if you do talk about these ideas somewhat, then it almost makes it to where you are karmically no longer responsible for the consequences of what you're doing to them, because you're saying what you're doing to them, therefore it's perfectly okay.
I even think, by the way, you could even say that's even something we all victimize ourselves with when we talk about the current thing. In doing the thing where you go on social media and you go, this is fucked up and wrong, we go, right, well, I've done my part. I don't have to actually address the reality of that in my life or anyone else's life.
Yeah. And so like that is the biggest kind of framing to where it pacifies you in a sense to where you don't actually enact like mirth, and you don't enact these good things in your life because you're on social media and you say the correct take on the current thing, and all of a sudden it's just perfectly okay, whereas the current thing and the framing of it is in a place to where there's no way to actually have a correct position on it. In the sense of the Hegelian dialectic, that like neither side is sort of ultimately on the side of full, absolute 100% truth in this situation. And this is a point that I understood like 10 plus years ago, before I was like really ever into any conspiratorial stuff. Is one thing that I noticed with all of these sort of, tragic events that would happen is that they're always, the ones that are always brought up are always the ones to where they are perfectly set up from like a WWE perspective, that both sides feel justified in having their position. And there's multiple layers that can be gone on from every single angle for that. Whereas the cases that are always brought up on, whether or not this authority structure did this, unjust thing to these people, it's never the cases that are 100% cut and dry that everybody would agree on. Those are never the cases that are brought up, which is if you believed in the idea that these sources actually wanted to get rid of these, injustices, then they would obviously bring up the most cut and dry cases.
Sure.
Because that's cases that everybody could agree upon. Whereas the purpose of a system is what it does, in that when the stories and events that are brought up are always perfectly crafted in order to create the most derision and make it to where you hate your fellow man as much as possible, then that is the purpose of what these stories are for.
Yes.
And it's not something that can be an accident for why these things happen, which also just goes into the idea that you don't have to look into every single detail about why this event is maybe not exactly as it was said. You can just look at, consistent patterns maybe for a couple of them, and then just understand that, like, all right, I don't need to understand, everything about this current thing. I just need to know that it's not something that's worth my time. It's not something that's worth paying attention to, and don't want to feed it any more energy, because ultimately that's the number one thing that is desired, in that when these stories are so perfectly set up to where everybody is going to get as emotional as possible, then it doesn't matter how you talk about it. What matters is that you're giving your own attention to it, even if you're giving it through, the conspiratorial lens, or you're giving it through this lens or that lens. There is no winning in this scenario by talking about it.
Yes.
So it's ultimately wraps around back into the idea that you become so much of a conspiracy theorist that you wrap around back into being a normie.
It's actually
with additional lenses.
Yeah, go on.
Just with additional lenses.
Because I would actually even say this is one reason why I always thought a really brilliant little flourish in 1984 was the idea that they had this like enforced 2 minutes of hate within the party. Because to me, the idea there is, it's the notion that what you're doing is you're allowing people in a safe way to have an enemy and to vent the feelings that surely actually must be sublimated feelings they have towards the control structure and the things that are unjust in their life and the things they wish they had power over and could change. But since they can't, you have this moment instead. I think this is just what social media is, where everyone goes online and they see the current thing. As you say, they're all perfectly crafted so that they can make it, bro, that even though in theory one side should have won or lost, both sides are mad. Like, have you never noticed how when your side wins, I'm using that in a pejorative sense, but you get what I mean. When your side wins on a topic, have you ever noticed how you never get the after party? You don't all sing "We Are the Champions," and then you don't all go, right, what a great day, let's see you tomorrow. What happens is you then immediately get pivoted to things like, but look what the other side's saying about our win, and they're not letting us enjoy it, and they're bloody doubling down, and they're doing that. And it's like there never is a win. And the goal at the end, the goal of the system clearly was everyone get mad about this, but for today you get to seem like you won, but it doesn't satisfy you, it doesn't do anything for you, it just makes you feel like shit as well. Then the other guy lost today, but you know what, don't worry, come back tomorrow, maybe he wins that day. There's definitely some of that going on as well. It's one of the reasons why I always worry about, like, I'll give you an example. Here's an example of a psyop that I can state very generally that everyone will immediately understand. When you said earlier, one of my most dreaded quotes of all time, which again, I'll just remind you, no God ever said this to anyone. It was just something cool that I forget even who the person who said it was. It'll have been a political figure or something like that, where it's the idea, never attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity, right? I think one of the ultimate traps, if you want to be malicious towards people, is just make them think that you're stupid. I can actually tell you, maybe people don't understand this, if you think about 5 years ago, there was a very famous politician in my country. There's certainly been some that, let's say, lived in the best position in your country and did this in the last 20 years, let's say, where the whole role of this guy, as far as I can tell, if I was casting him in WWE, is he's a heel, but he's a stupid heel. And so even when he fucks everything up and does what's actually really malicious, maybe takes away the ideas of rights. Notice I don't say take away your rights. Takes away the ideas of certain rights, or fucks up the world in some way, or spends all the money on horrible things. You can't ever fully hold him to account, because it's the notion, well, he's a bloody idiot, isn't he? So in the same way as this in your country was a certain figure 20 years ago, the one that was 5 years ago in my country, his whole role was to fuck everything up in all the important areas, but do it in such a bumbling sort of like, oh, terribly sorry, what have I done? Oh, bloody. And that made you think like, nah, this fucking idiot, he's just a bloody idiot, isn't it? So you could be mad at him and say, I want him out of whatever position he's in, but you never really took it as like, that's evil. Like, let's examine that. Let's start guard against that. And I can tell you in the case of the person in my country, I don't know as much about the one in yours, that was literally the equivalent of a wrestling character. This individual actually was an incredibly intelligent person who had like excellent recall, for example, deep knowledge of certain texts that would really impress people if they were to hear about it. But he understood, and in fact, this person had even, if people know I'm talking about, they get where I'm going here, they had actually a mini media career before they became a prominent political figure, where they built up that character almost like a sitcom character. Like, oh, he's that guy where we love him because he's almost like a rascal in terms of how stupid he is. Like, just silly and bumbling. And then, he makes the odd lucid point, but what a fucking idiot this guy is. And the reason why I bring this up is I have found one of the most seductive psyops of all time is where you just appeal to people that they are smarter than the people doing the bad things or enacting the bad things or even just the pawns of the bad things. I mean, the simple idea is all politicians are just stupid. They're all incompetent. None of them know what they're doing, and they all fail, at least when they're on the other side, all the time. In fact, even the ones on our side fail, but at least they're on our side and they probably believe what we do, so whatever, we'll forgive them for now and hope they get better. Right? The reason why that's crazy to me, bro, is if you consider, if you were to look like an alien at society, you'd go, wait a minute, some of the people who are those stupid politicians, but also the people who fund them, the people who give them their marching orders, and then the people who control what they do and influence them, they're getting everything they want, mate. They're getting a load of money and power, and they're getting you to do it. But that's weird. I thought you said they fucked up. I thought you said these guys like tripped over on shoelaces, a banana went up their nose, and then they landed in a pile of shit. Like, I don't get it. They're idiots, but somehow they, at the end, I guess it's just luck, the bad guys won again. And so it's why I also think, to tie into this, if you ever want to make something really, really out there that's bullshit seem real, just make it seem mildly incredulous. Like, wow, can you believe this? And then people will just go, well, of course, bloody mad world, isn't it? Everyone's an idiot. For some reason, that idea is so seductive for people.
Yeah. So the figure that you're referring, like, it's such a perfect, like, professional wrestling character for the specific role that is being taken. Whereas, you have the out of kayfabe interviews to where it's, perfectly reciting some like Greek Iliad in the original language. And it should just reveal that, okay, these people aren't the characters that they portray.
Yes.
And that the roles that they take are not something that is authentically the stated positions of what they have, which always goes into the idea of, everybody believes that the enemy politician, like, this is a kind of a point that everybody understands the idea that politicians never do what they actually claim to do.
Yes.
And then whenever it's the enemy politician that's getting in, they're going to do everything that they say times 10, which it's like, they're always in the long run going to revert back to the central and revert back to the normalcy.
Yes.
Which just goes into that if you're ever going to be looking or analyzing in that sphere, you never want to be reactive, in that to react is to lose. And it's why you would want to look at things from the scale of, all right, this is something that happened, 3 years ago. What were the actual consequences of it? What did people think was going to happen? And then what did actually happen? And then when you see these consistent patterns of how this is what people thought the world was going to be like, and then it never actually manifests into that kind of thing, then you can take that from the lens of, okay, then that's probably going to apply to the things that happen right now, in that everything is very predictable, in that nothing ever happens, as the saying goes. And so when you see people never really, in the same way that with media, people will always look at the newest media and then never look at the 50 years of library of absolute amazing stuff that exists, that they could delve into and they could gain a lot of value from. Whenever people are looking at the political lens, on whatever lens that they're looking through, they're always looking at the current thing that is a unfinished story. Because, if you took the Bible and you made it to where everything about the Bible was consistent with the way that it was, except for at the end, Jesus did not resurrect, then all of a sudden the entire point of the story is completely gone, because the entire point was the buildup to that.
Sure.
So you always want to be looking at things that are completed stories, because when something is sort of halfway in, it's really easy to kind of think about it in the same way with Game of Thrones. It's, first three seasons are amazing. And, this is totally going to be the best TV show ever created. And then now, once it's actually been finished, because the latter half of it was so poor, people don't even go back to watch the first, 3 seasons. And relating that specifically to any politics or any political lens is that if you were to understand where things would be 5 years from now, looking at the current events that you're looking at right now, you wouldn't be paying attention to them, because so much of the reasons that you're paying attention to them is the belief that certain things are going to happen, certain outcomes are possible. And then once you look at 5 years later, it's like, no, I would never accept this, never do any of this. And me putting all of my faith into this one particular person to suddenly be my hero that I'm going to worship. Okay, maybe they were never actually going to do that. And I was the mark. I was the dumb doofus for actually believing that this guy was ever going to do anything.
I'll even give you an example of how psyops do work in like a Hegelian dialectic, like I say, to accomplish not only the goal of like they do something and then you have a reaction, which sometimes even the reaction benefits the system, but then the synthesis actually makes you join in, become complicit and tacitly agree and actually enact misguidedly evil yourself. So I'll give you an example. When someone, because I've had this happen many times and I only realized it later, a lot of things I would have said were my core beliefs. I used to even use the classic thing. I would describe myself as like, I'm centre left on a lot of issues. You know, I'm fiscally conservative, but I'm socially liberal. And, you know, I believe in free speech and I think you should have a right to defend yourself. And I would do all the classic fucking things, which, by the way, just sounds like you're repeating some sort of like, unexamined
mantra.
Dogma from a religion. Yeah, absolutely. It just sounds like you're just reading out a bunch of the things, but you're not someone who had a deep, insight where you experienced gnosis and actually that's a spiritual truth. It's just something these are the things I'm supposed to believe to be a good person, so I say them all. So when you do that, I'll give you an example of how some of those psyops work. So one of them that actually used to work on me even, because guess what? Think about this accent. I am English. I am technically British. That's a national identity, but I'm of the English people. And so when I used to look over the old pond at you Yankee Doodles, I used to see, and I would, you know what? Imagine this. I would go, bloody hell. I don't believe they're still doing that thing with weaponry. Wow, don't they get it? Everyone who dies because of that wouldn't happen if you didn't have the weapons, you idiots. Just get rid of the weapons. And what I didn't realise was, if you were to make regulations and rules which further limited or eventually completely banned weaponry, you would still have weapons that did crimes. The difference now would be the main people I would have eliminated having weapons were the people who didn't want to do crimes or evil things, because I would do it through law and legislation. And so law-abiding people who think of themselves as good and don't want to break the law and don't want to break the social contract would then not have the weapon. And now all the evil people who get the weapon illegally, by the way, in my country there are illegal weapons. People might be shocked how many there might be. In fact, if you ever look up very specifically demographically based crime stats, you'll actually find there are European countries that have more of those weapon crimes where it's illegal to own the gun legally. I said the thing there, whatever. The magic stick, we all get the boomstick from Quake. It's illegal to own it than actually certain demographics of Americans who actually are the ones we lecture about they must have more control of their weapons. So essentially, because they use the example of a misuse of the weapon that is easy to see as horrible and I wish didn't exist, it's a way to then get me to agree, right, we have to restrict all the weapons. That means essentially me and you presumably won't have the weapon, but the bad guy gets it anyway and he was going to get it illegally anyhow. So now essentially we're just at his mercy. I'll give you a couple of other ones. You can spring off any of these how you want. Another one would be, I used to do the old freeze peach. I used to be like, hey, because people are restricting my peach and they're telling me my peach can't be frozen, that means that actually what I need to stand for is everyone should have totally equal, unlimited frozen peaches. Because in doing so, I get my peach, you have your peach, and that's fine. And what I didn't realise here is because peaches can actually have magical effects on the world and do influence everyone to some degree, even the person using them. The problem then is I'm now acting like all peaches are of equal value and they should be treated accordingly under the law and in society. So if I do that, well, you know what? Sometimes I actually get what I asked for, but it just wasn't my peach. And all of a sudden, Yasukeh, I notice, wait a minute, I'm supposed to believe in frozen peaches, but actually someone else having their peach means that they get to do like it's incredibly dangerous, indecent and offensive things in public that have now ruined, like, for example, social settings or family environments, etc. Maybe they can be incredibly degenerate and indecent and can do things that in the past we would have just easily seen as a tribe, like kick this person the fuck out, exile them. They are actually misleading the youth in a really evil way. Now I have to go, well, you know what, mate? For me to have my peach, even though I actually have good intentions and plan to do great things and have never been shown to have any evil, you better have your peach. It's of equal value. And then lastly, this obviously ties into the idea of like, well, you know what? Since at the moment the control structure and the regime doesn't agree with my ideas of what's good or beautiful or true, that's because everyone has their own truth, their own beauty. As a result, there is no objectivity. Everything's subjective. Well, what do you know? Then all of a sudden, you have to have things like, I have to grant religious freedom to people whose whole role is to be evil through religion. I have to grant things like that to people in terms of, again, ideas that are very harmful to society. And even worse, I have to get on some angle. And by the way, as far as I can tell, this actual quote was never said. And this quote might even be by a person who I'm not sure existed. I have to do that thing of like, you know what? Not only am I going to let you have your frozen peach, Yasukeh, but even worse, I'll fight to the death to defend your right to have that peach and impose it on me, my family, my community. Mm-hmm. I think this is a great example. I said the magic word, but I put a couple of examples of what I think are psyops out there of how actually the synthesis of me reacting to the psyop works on one level anyway. Then there's the opposition to it, but then the conclusion I end up coming to actually plays into what I think in the team fight was them repositioning me to an area of even more effect if I then get a damage spell put on me, if you get me.
Yeah, so there's quite a few points to go off on there. That was a whole big bag to unpack. So the first thing would be that people always want to have the beliefs that are almost convenient for them and their position.
Yes.
In that, if something can bolster yourself and your own stuff up, then obviously you're going to have it. And people that don't have your thing are horrible and evil. And these things are the exact things that are making people to be in the position that is so bad for them. And if they just did the same things that I did, then they would be perfect. Because the way that I do things is so perfect. It also goes into the lens of people never really look at second order effects or anything past that.
Yes.
In that, if you want a super clean society where you have public transit, you have all of these really nice walkable cities, then, like what do the places that actually do have those things do? What is the conditions of the society that they have? Like, you look at, Singapore. How does Singapore treat things that, you might find as a value, but if you take that value, then all of a sudden you're not allowed to have all of the nice things. That these things aren't separate from each other. You can't just take one thing away in isolation and then expect only this one thing will change. If you only take away the boomsticks, then only this one thing will go down and absolutely nothing else will change. Where there's so many second order effects that are hidden because they're not directly causal. And oftentimes there's a big thing in that not only one is that stat tracking is incredibly corrupt, false. Like many stats are just not actually accurate.
That goes into what you said earlier. Notice how the same people, like, they just lie to us all the time. Oh, wait, this stat supports my opinion. Well, look at the stats. It's evidence. It has to be true.
Yeah, where it's like, on the point of stats, like there's one example of this idea of people supporting this idea of, stats in the field that they're very comfortable in and confident in when it comes to the kind of topics that you were just talking about. And then because everything works in their field to come to the conclusions that they want, then all of a sudden, when the same stats talk about, seed oils being good, because in their particular field, they have no reason to be skeptical of the stats because they support their preconceived notions. They have no reason to be skeptical of like, okay, all of the foundational studies that showed that, saturated fat was bad or that seed oils were good, they're all fraudulent. And none of this stuff is accurate. So they don't have the foundation to look at it. And if they accept the idea that stats might be false, then all of a sudden, that's a very uncomfortable thought that they have to have even within their own field. So they're just never going to take that conclusion on. And now they're just going to be consistently supporting, seed oil consumption, as an example. And then it also goes into the idea in that, in what world would you expect the world to become an ideal place for what your will is when it's not your people getting into power? Like, do you actually just expect for the enemies of you that do control these systems to actually give you the ultimate conclusion that you want? Because they'll give you a whole bunch of little bits and pieces that may fit into the idea of something that might pacify you in that, okay, we won on this thing, that thing, and the other thing, but it's really, 5% of what you want. And it comes with this 15% of all of these other negative consequences that come with it that you didn't want at all. And it's also just goes to the point of, in the same way that, a lot of stats lie, a lot of stats will lie in particular directions. And it's just really hard to actually sort of parse things out, which also just comes into the idea of sometimes you're just going to have to take things from other lenses that aren't necessarily statistically valid. Like, this is a whole big thing with the current thing, and just overall general lack of trust in institutions, in that the science-based lifter is never, everybody who actually understands anything about working out will look at the person who classifies themselves as a science-based lifter and understand all of the holes and all of the flaws within their processes and how this isn't actually the best thing to work, which goes into the idea that you have to understand things through different lenses and come to conclusions that are based in things that you actually have more of an ability to trust with. And that goes into any type of piece of data or any type of number that you don't have any way of verifying, you should automatically assume is probably false.
Yes.
Because if there's no way for you or anybody else to verify something, then you're never going to know whether or not something is correct or not. An example that I would give is just, social media numbers, to where you have no idea if, this person actually has this many people that click the subscribe button or this many views on this video, or even if these videos actually even existed 10 years ago. Like, this channel says that, they've been making videos since 2013, but have they actually? Like, you have no idea about how to verify, how big something is or how suppressed something is. All of these things are very opaque. And when something is opaque, there is absolutely no incentive not to lie about something, especially when it's not a fundamental moral principle that you have. And is there any belief that these institutions have a moral imperative not to lie? And so this is why you'll see so many of these, studies and stuff come out as frauds. And then nobody will ever take the logical conclusion of, okay, what if it's with all of these other things? But then also taking it back into the idea that, the same sources that told me that the study was true is also the same sources that are telling me that it's a lie.
Yes.
So why are they telling me that it's a lie in this one particular lens? Which also probably goes back into the whole blackmail thing, in that delegitimizing certain things can affirm other aspects. So if you say that, oh, these particular sources are untrustworthy, then that implies that there could be some sources that are trustworthy. And there was another point, but I think that's pretty good for now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll even say that's actually one thing to make a broader point that I know you understand. When people actually, here's what's amazing about how we've all been conditioned. One of the craziest things about the way, at least I'll have to say in the English language speaking world, I can't speak to another one. I don't fluently speak a language. I don't participate in another language. So I'm in the Anglosphere at all times at this point in time, even when I'm speaking to other people who it's second language English. In the Anglosphere, they've even conditioned all of us, and you'll know exactly what I mean. When you're talking about something being wrong today in terms of consensus thinking, either that it is wrong or that it is wrong, but you found the truth and one day everyone will acknowledge the truth. The examples everyone goes to themselves are always the most famous psyops that you just never looked into. And so you give that example. And so basically, I've actually got another rule I tell people, which is even as a figure of speech, I try not to say things like, well, you think that thing is true. Well, it can't be. You're like those people thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, who thought this other thing, which we just all acknowledge isn't true, but I've never looked into. So I just assume that's the best go-to example. I always say to people, I know you're just doing that as like a macro. You're just doing it as a shorthand because you assume that's a consensus. We all agree that that thing used to be considered real about maybe the nature of the world we live in. But actually, we all agree it's wrong now. But I always say, why not just pick something that you categorically know is untrue or that you know was untrue once and was actually changed and you know all the mechanics of it, and then it would just be a brilliant example. And if the other person also shared some of that knowledge, they'd really get a sense of what you're saying. Instead, what's crazy about the conditioning is oftentimes there's also another layer like that where when you go back, that's exactly the thing that also was nonsense. And in fact, sometimes where we're told there was progress, they went from X to Y, actually X seems more true and Y was the psyop lie that then was accepted by everyone and went beyond that. And now you're using that as an example of like, that's like when everyone, and it's like, actually, that was another layer of psyop.
Yeah, this goes into just being kind of critical and skeptical of anything that you have as a turn of phrase that is present in your own language, because you don't necessarily realize what kind of spells that you're casting into the world when you're saying a particular phrase. And it's always useful to look at these things with a skeptical lens and saying, oh, why am I actually saying this thing? What is the source of this? And is this something that actually is within the wheelhouse of how I want to live my life? And, you look at the origin of certain phrases like, holy hell or goddamn. Like these phrases do come from Hollywood movies, but it's also like, why would you say that in the, why would you say those things in your common everyday vernacular when you're just like, oh, something bad happened.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to say that hell is holy. Like, do you understand what you're actually saying right there? And it's, the same idea behind, saying gosh darn. You're really just substituting a curse word, but everybody understands what you're actually trying to say. And the substitution doesn't make it to where you're not actually saying that thing.
Yes.
You're just saying it with one layer of abstraction.
Yes.
So it's the question of like, all right, what are these phrases that I have in my vernacular, in my vocabulary, and are these things that I actually want to have? There was an anecdote that Starman brought up at one point, which is that he's, talking to some family and has this idea of, oh, you guys all listen to like classical music. That's a really great thing. I would want that for my family, before he had a family. And then the guy is like, oh, that's cool. Well, what do you listen to now? And he's like, all right, Linkin Park and Eminem. And so it's, if you want to live your life in a certain way, you have to be aware and conscious of all of these things. And also just goes into your inputs, in that me being somebody who didn't grow up in the 80s, I did not exist then. I look back at I went through a phase of watching quite a few 80s movies. And then I realized that the entire personality, the entire turn of phrases, library that people used who grew up in that age, it all comes from movies and all comes from media.
Yes.
And just realizing that and seeing that, makes it so clear that, okay, the same thing is probably happening in my life. How many turns of phrases am I getting that I don't support the meaning of? And I would not want to actually say these things and manifest them in reality. And that's the kind of reference culture that you start referencing things and you start to lose the meaning of where the reference even came from. And then it just becomes something that's sort of embedded into your speech, where you want to be thinking, is this something that I actually want to have in my life? If I want my family to listen to classical music, then I better not be listening to, Eminem and Death Grips right now.
Yes.
Like I better start listening to classical music. So if I want my thoughts to be more pure, then I have to start thinking in a more clear way that is parallel to what my ideals are, and then actually follow up and not use those terms and not use those verbiage that I don't support, because I want to say what I mean and I want to mean what I say.
Yeah, I'll also say another example. I thought like I could give a little bit of a specific here while I'm being general. People get the angle I'm talking about here. In the same way as there's a nice conspiratorial rabbit hole that goes down the social conditioning angle of, are musicians themselves part of this? Because obviously they are always all presented as, they start as the outsider, and then, their groove's just so great, man, and they speak the truth to the people, and then, just the cynical record company just wants to make money, so they just put it out. And in fact, sometimes if they're really sort of revolutionary, damn it, the record company's really mad that they're saying that, but the album's just selling too damn well, I guess they just gonna have to let them get away with it. Not only do I think that's, again, cart before the horse, like these people are crafted, selected, you are filtered out if you actually have truly revolutionary or dangerous messages, etc. But also I'll go one further and I'll do the trick that I always think people should do in politics, but they just don't for some reason for about the last maybe 50 or 60 years. People just forgot to do this and became literalists and just started saying things on social media in public, maybe because they relaxed what you could say. And as a result, people didn't understand the power of metaphor, which is, I always think the most brilliant way to represent a social or a political concern is to make it in a fantasy novel, where in theory, if you can see the parallels, it's clearly actually just about now and us and what's happening, but you make it seem like it was somewhere far away in a different time with different creatures even that are sort of humanoid, but maybe there's even magical powers and stuff. So I'll do that. I'll give you a scenario, because you actually spurred me to think of this when you said earlier about how these blackmailed celebrities, including pop singers, maybe they themselves are essentially acting as spies with the way they're sort of compromised and forced to act. They're essentially like double agents. Well, one thing people might not know is I've read actually a bit about double agents, and supposedly the secret of a double agent isn't what every movie tells you. It isn't that they're actually an agent for one side who pretends to represent the other side. Because if they did that, you'd sniff them out really quickly and it'd be very hard for them to get through certain thresholds. The real secret of a double agent is they're sort of mirroring dissociative disorder, and they are a double agent. They are an agent for both sides. As far as I can tell, Yasukeh, it even appears that actually this is one of the reasons why, you notice in movies, there's a classic trope that doesn't make sense, where you're like the top spy or a really key figure doing a really important job to save the world. But what does the guy above you in the power structure always tell you? He tells you, now, if you're caught and exposed, we will disavow you and we'll never acknowledge you're a spy. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, that's the good guy. Why would you do that? It's because essentially, to be a good double agent, you actually truly do have to like make part of yourself believe both sides of it and do both aspects. It's just that you're also sort of like, if you could ever acknowledge both at the same time, yeah, you'd be at war with yourself. But actually, you live a double life. You're one at one point and you're one at the other. It's why I actually tell people, in most cases, this is a controversial take, but it's all good, get the pitchforks out. A lot of people who might, let's say, be indiscreet regarding their relationship with a partner in a way that's indecent and brings shame upon their partner. I actually think a lot of those people, it's not like the partner will then claim like, oh my God, the whole life was a lie and they never loved me and all they ever wanted was this other thing and they never wanted me. I would actually say to a lot of them, actually in most cases, it seems like it was both. This person wanted to live the double life. They wanted to have you and they probably did have still some connection and affection for you. That's why they didn't just leave you. But at the same time, they also wanted this other thing, which involved them being another person with that person. But it wasn't that one's true and one isn't. You notice I've given this example about a lot of charismatic two-faced people in esports. The conclusion I came to was, they are two-faced. It's not that one's a mask and one's the face. They have both faces, and their actual skill is to be able to move between them and get whatever result they want. So if I was to write this fantasy novel, imagine this for a second, in a different world that's not our world, but it looks very similar to our world. And it isn't our music industry with our alphabet agencies, Yasukeh. It's just one that has alphabet agencies and it has a music industry, right? Imagine how clever it would be if the intelligence agencies did use pop stars, celebrities as spies. Because here's what you could get out of it that would be a feature, not a bug, of using a famous person. Well, first of all, they're a famous person in a totally different field, so you would never assume they could be that. And also, the people who tend to say they are, well, they're all crazy, aren't they? Then I'll give you another example. If you're going to be some kind of an intelligence operative, it's going to be really tricky, because if you need to go to different parts of the world, people are going to know you've gone there and they might guess you're an intelligence operative. But what if you had a different reason to go there? Maybe you went there to play a concert or play a sporting event or do all sorts of things. And as a result, you could freely pass through a border. You had a valid reason to be there. No one would suspect anything because you were there. But this way, there's actually a film, I'll drop a film for people here, where this idea is presented in a fantasy film as like, well, obviously this is a tall tale. I'm a fan, even though he's a bit of a dark wizard, of the scriptwriter Charlie Kaufman, who did, Adaptation and Being John Malkovich. And the one script he wrote that a lot of people forget was this one called Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, where exactly this is the wacky premise. It's the premise that in real life, there was a guy in America who was a talk show or a game show host, I think. And basically, he later claimed, and people thought it was just, like some wacky memoirs or old man talk, like, oh, I was actually secretly an operative doing all these missions while I was that celebrity. And that's why you just never suspected. Now, this is always presented, hence why they made the film this way, as fantastic. Like, it's absurd. This could never be. So my point I was making here is, one, there's a little interesting side I've been thinking about for people. And then two, that's another thing that I don't think people realise. If you go into my fantasy novel there, it's actually a very efficient, kind of clean way to accomplish spycraft. It's just that it sounds absurd. So it can't be true. We wouldn't consider it, would we?
Yeah, the spy wouldn't be just some random diplomat. They would be, this super beloved figure that, oh, of course, this politician wants to talk with them because they just really love their movies.
Yes.
They really love their music. So obviously you're going to see them in the same room and nothing is going to be none the wiser. I will do the forbidden thing in that, let's just say that if, this fantasy novel were to take place in real life, an example of something you could see is, Sylvester Stallone, to where if you look at the mechanism of his movies, right, it's like, all right, the height of the Cold War, what do we get Rocky for? To where it's exactly sort of playing into that idea. You look at, one of the Rambo movies. This is something you talked about in Foreplay, so it's okay.
Yeah.
There's a Rambo movie, right, to where the movie at the end says thank you to this one particular group that exists in these countries. Indeed. And then the next movie
it's different when you watch it now, doesn't it? That particular screen, I know.
Yeah. The next movie that they were planning was to go against that exact same group.
Yes.
But then they realized that, this is probably a little bit too on the nose. We wouldn't do that. And then, you look at this person, this movie star, and then you see them, talking to all these people. They go to all these places. They do all of these things. And, it's, I guess they're just really interested in, 80s actions movies. All these people are just really, really interested in that stuff. But to give a example of how these things would work, it's always useful to give sort of parallels of how things would work in fiction. Yes. Because it's an actual mechanistic example of how these things can operate in an ideal, to where you don't have that electric fence hitting you, to where you get shocked by the idea of considering that it's a thing. you had a segment on it at one point of kind of exploring this idea, even though you might not have watched it, is Attack on Titan. I had some kind of thread explaining just the idea of how in that anime, there is a mechanism for how there is stolen history,
yes,
and how certain things are framed, and how everybody is living in this almost parallel society to where
it's actually a really brilliant metaphor, I've got to say. So I only heard the description of it from you, but essentially from some of the things I've explored, it actually makes me very interested in whoever wrote that anime, mate. I thought that was like a brilliant insight as to how you guard information and how you could lose track of the past.
Yeah. All of those mechanisms work exactly how I would postulate it might be able to work in some other parallel idea. And in that anime, there's also this, this cult that is the cult of the walls, the 3 concentric walls, you might say. Also, another obvious parallel there. But there is this cult of the walls to where there's people in all sorts of areas of influence on every level of the society. And they all know to some level about the secret. And they're all religiously devoted to their idea of keeping the secret safe. And there's no way that you could possibly torture the information out of somebody. And that level of religious devotion is what you would need to keep a secret safe. If you operate on a blackmail economy, then, somebody might have a crisis of conscience to where they're like, I even if they, destroy my family, I can't keep this secret anymore. So I'm going to have to leave it out there. And when you live in a world to where there's never, ever anybody that sort of comes out and authentically sort of reveals the wall cult, the metaphorical wall cult, then that would show that there's probably some level of religious devotion that goes into it, which is also, on an aside, this also goes into the point to where I agree with the most stringent anti-conspiracy theorist more than I agree with the normie median level conspiracy theorist, in that, if you take any one particular event and it's like, oh, but think about how many people would have to be in on it. And it's like, yeah, that's true. Like, some people will take the idea of, oh, for this one particular event to happen in this way, only 5 people would have to know the truth. But no, in reality, there would have to be a much larger cohort of people. Not necessarily everybody will have to know every single detail. There is some level of compartmentalization working there, but you would have to have a larger amount of people that are religiously devoted to an idea in order to enact any type of larger professional wrestling match onto the population.
Yes. Right.
Because like the professional wrestling analogy is just the idea of, like, in a professional wrestling match, every single person that is involved has to be in on it. The referees, the wrestlers,
yes,
the commentators. You can't have just one person randomly showing up there and be like, all right, this is just a legitimate MMA sporting match. Like, that would reveal the entire game.
Sure.
So everybody who has a significant role has to be a part of it. Maybe, the security for the venue, maybe they don't have to know everything. Maybe only a couple of them have to know something. But ultimately, everybody just has to have some level of awareness and knowledge of their roles for any larger deception to ever actually be enacted.
I thought the way we could wrap up, because we've done some psyops, we've built in the mechanisms, how they work. We've talked about like structures of family and things like this, and how to distribute information, when to maybe even not buy into information yourself. I thought a thing we might do at the end, it's actually why on that Nick Hinton episode you referenced, I actually sort of tricked people on that one, didn't I? Because they thought, holy fuck, he's got one of the greatest researchers of the schizo threads of our modern day. He must just ask loads of deep questions about conspiracies. And then what you actually ended up listening to was certainly a discussion about conspiracy and certain aspects of truth and life and poignancy. But it was actually, I was sort of trying to guide people caught in the maze, in the labyrinth of conspiracy, I was trying to be the Ariadne with the thread and guide them back out. And I found someone where I thought they were a great example of someone who'd sort of managed to move themselves back away from the danger and move more towards where they could engage with life while still knowing some of these things. So similarly, I'd like at the end now to talk a little bit about that and get your perspective on how people can think about these things, engage with them, maybe even find people to discuss them with, but also keep themselves safe, have a little bit of OPSEC, to have protocols to stop making yourself become a target, or to self-target yourself, or self-victimize yourself, or actually to even destroy yourself. And so if you'll notice, one of the reasons I'm very careful about how I speak about these things, I actually didn't get the idea from censorship. If you notice, I'm not just doing that thing where I'm like, it's like the, I'm trying to think what even the, what's it? I don't put it this way. I don't just use the famous euphemisms, even though I did my joke on with the boomstick there. I don't actually use the famous euphemisms people use for how to not say the dreaded curse words, which I do think is important. I actually came to that from trying to think how you explain a concept to someone. And I did realize to someone that classic wisdom, which is again misused, of like, if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it. It's like, you do realize you did just essentially suggest a 5-year-old could comprehend every important idea ever, which is a fucking mental idea, by the way. Like, I don't know what 5-year-olds you've met, but that's fucking bonkers. But as usual, the non-warped version is, if you really understand it, you would be able to say it without just hitting the emotional words and the cursed words and without hitting the third rail. Essentially, you could sort of talk around it in a way where someone could infer what it meant. And in doing so, I mean, the amazing thing I realized was, because I'm someone who thinks a lot about how I speak and express myself and write especially, I realized it actually involves making yourself level up. You're going to actually have to get a lot more skilled with how you use language and how you explain and lay out ideas and models, because if you can do so, then you're going to be able to essentially avoid all the rails. You're going to be able to avoid the triggers and the traps. And in the modern day, the joke is, if you're really scared about, let's say, non-human intelligences being able to get triggered and trap us in some way, well, in theory, only a human can come to some of the conclusions inferred from what I'm saying. So actually, because you don't say the certain word, it doesn't trigger the alarm bell in the same way. And so, I mean, the analogy here would be, I'll just use one from movies for people. It would be like the idea of standing still so the Tyrannosaurus Rex doesn't see you. We'll just leave that incredibly booby-trapped concept right there, but everyone gets it because they've seen the movie. In that particular scenario, you could still actually, in theory, move across the area where the Tyrannosaurus Rex was. You'd just have to go really slowly, and every time it's looking away, take a little step, wouldn't you? And if you did that, that would actually be more effective than just running or even distracting it. And so I actually have my own angle, and then I want to get yours. So what I would tell people is this. I have actually made this point to people of, how the fuck can this podcast, including this episode I'm doing right now, how can it exist, Yasukeh? How can it be on YouTube? How is the channel not struck to oblivion? How is everyone not all over me with every sponsor? How is like my entire life not picked apart? How have people not inferred all the things that I must think or could think, or the sort of thought crime I must have committed? How is it possible? And the reason why is actually those safeguards, but there's another angle to it as well. Because actually, by the way, I don't know about you, but all the podcasts I listen to that give me all the super salacious, really juicy, amazing conspiracy stuff, mate, they're not on YouTube. They don't even try to be on YouTube. They're on other platforms. Sometimes they're even totally paywalled. And the idea is that's where they even do that. Like, finally, guys, we can talk about what we actually think, even though I'm also selling this to anyone who pays the price and edits the thing, which is like, whoa, I thought this was dangerous stuff, mate. So what I will say is this. I also think you have to understand a bit of human psychology, which is I have not in any way, when I express these ideas, ever set myself up to be a threat to the control system, and in the following ways. So as a result, I don't actually have to fear retribution. And from what I've seen of other people who did this, it seems like they've also passed through this sort of threshold without being destroyed by the booby traps. So what I would say is this. First of all, I don't believe in unearned wisdom, so I only drop breadcrumbs, and I'll only walk people a certain way, and I'll give them like parts of a puzzle that they actually can never even vaguely complete unless they can provide some themselves, and they have to earn those through their own efforts. So one thing I will say is this: I don't ever seek power in any way in Babylon, in the mainstream world. I don't do it. If anything, if you actually notice, my own esports work, mate, has become much, much more niche than what it was 10 years ago, when, by the way, notice the control structure held me up. I was actually held up when I had very different political views as actually like an example of a very successful person. So what I've done instead is I just realized once everything scaled up, actually a really niche perspective still could actually have enough to be able to support me and allow me to succeed. So I don't seek power. I similarly don't seek mass appeal. I know it might seem like it because I'm putting it on YouTube, but I'm not really doing some of the things I could do. I could clickbait the titles a lot more. I could actually have different types of guests on. I could even just directly address the topics. Look, I probably would eventually get the ban, whether that was part of the system or not. I mean, I'm not a paid actor, so I imagine I would get the ban. But I could do that if I wanted to get short-term, a bit of drama, a bit of thrill. Similarly, so I don't seek power, I don't seek mass appeal. And then this is the last detail, and it's going to sound so harsh, but I feel like you of all people might understand this, which is I'm not trying to wake everyone up and save them. I'm going to go back again to the Matrix. The reason why is even though I actually think the Matrix itself is one of the greatest works of pastiche with very little original ideas that definitely didn't come from the individuals who say they made it. And it seems like actually they also took a lot of spiritual truths and then warped them to fit their own ideas, as is always the way. Hence why it's one of the biggest selling movies of all time and it had a massive effect on culture. But I'll use the metaphor because everyone gets it. I'm not trying to go, if I was Morpheus, I'm not actually trying to free everyone in the Matrix, Yasukeh. I'm only trying to free the right people, the ones that matter to me in the Matrix, that I think would be important to me or already are important to me. And even then, as we discussed in the first half of the conversation, I'm not actually doing it as brutal as Morpheus did, because everyone's probably seen that meme, which even makes me chuckle. The one where it's like, Neo, you have to leave the Matrix where they have steak that tastes like steak and eat the gruel and live in the shit, dungeon with me. And it's like, that is what it's like telling grandma about what happened 50 years ago, she's just eating gruel now, homie, and she isn't liking it. So what I try to do is I do think of some of the other people as sometimes they're NPCs. On one level, that isn't even me doing it. Some of them are cattle for the predators, I'm afraid, Yasukeh. And I can tell you what, the predators always go for the weak ones and the ones that are just the herd cattle. They wouldn't go for the one that was like, you stay just ahead of the curve. You just stay out of the way of it all. You sort of duck and dive at the right moments. And I just try and save a few people that are close to me and hopefully myself, because I don't think you can actually do more than that. So I want to know, what is Yasukeh's perspective on this? I notice even though you propagate ideas, that you also have a fairly guarded Discord. You do these things in quite a careful way on YouTube. So do you have a perspective on this? How do you get some ideas out there, or maybe just for your own sake, express them without making yourself a target for people who definitely have the power to do things against you potentially?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of points with this. Is that one is that you never want to be setting yourself up into where you're directly casting yourself as an enemy under the eye of Sauron. You always want to be guarding yourself in a way to where, in the same way that a lot of certain conspiracies have like multiple primary angles in which they go towards. The benefit of talking about things in generalities and distilling their truth to their most basic core principles is that it is both beneficial in terms of helping other people that could potentially be like-minded to you get more onto your wavelength, onto your plane. And it also protects you from the people that would be your enemies. So in this sense, it is so incredibly valuable to talk about things in a generalized sense. But then there's also the sense of to where it depends on the kind of circle that you're in, to where you almost can have the ability of being so comically over the top, in which you say the most wild out there thing. And that might get people to be like, oh, hey, that might be interesting. Look into it. Or they'll like, such a good joke. This is what a funny little idea. And then not actually think that you're serious. So there's some value in existing in the comedy realm that like Charles Carroll, as an example, operates in that you always want to be taking every relationship that you have and ultimately have the question of, what do I want this relationship to look like? And then if I don't have certain people in my life, what relationships do I want to manifest? If I'm talking about everything as directly as possible and saying everything without any veil whatsoever, I'm creating relationships by both creating people that are wanting to get unearned wisdom and then also creating my own enemies who are there to try to defeat me and try to smite me.
Yes.
So in that sense, I never want to create a enemy that I don't need to deal with, because I'm already dealing with so many enemies as it is, just as a nature of a man in the modern age. So, like, you know, when you're always talking to those kind of people who could be your enemies, you can even talk about these ideas that you want to talk about if you just frame them in the correct way. I can pretty much say so many points that would be against that modern paradigm, but then you can frame them in a way that will protect you and still allows you to say the idea to where, let's say there's one potential enemy in this group and one potential friend, then the friend can understand what you're saying. And giving all of these signals for your people while also not giving signals that will hurt you. Yes. Which also goes into one thing of, you know, a very useful place to get this, if you don't have any of these circles already built in, is just go to the sauna. You know, there's all of these health benefits to the sauna, but it's also one of these places to where, you know, men can be in a place to where you're all sitting there in suffering and you all have kind of, there's a little bit of like sort of like alt health stuff that kind of goes into it. So everybody that goes into the sauna has a particular mindset, and you can really just kind of talk about all of these ideas in a way to where nobody really feels trapped. There's always a idea of like, okay, I need to get out of this conversation because I'm done with my sauna. And so nobody feels trapped in the conversation, which allows people. Right. Yeah. So it allows people to speak freely, and the kind of conversations that you can consistently have in the sauna are just absolutely insane. And you can develop these friendships and these friend groups from scratch, from nil. And it's always the question of, there are certain things that you don't have in your life. And instead of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, just try to find a round peg. And so when you don't have these certain people in your life that you can talk about these ideas with, then where are the places that you're going to find them? Actively seek them out instead of trying to talk with people that are completely inappropriate for the job for, which just ultimately goes into, you know, if you're going to a party, what's the number one thing that you want to have happen? For me, it's, I want everybody to come out of this thinking, wow, this was an amazing time. I had a great time. I want everybody to be having the best time possible. And that involves maybe, you know, doing things that are against what my natural inclination would be towards. So ultimately, it just comes down to treating people individually in the way that is best suited towards the goals that are what you want that relationship to be. And that sounds like obviously, but so few people actually enact that in their life, in that they know that they shouldn't create enemies, but they create enemies everywhere that they go. You see so many people in, you know, esports that come into this idea of, you know, these based ideas that we all have. And all they do is just create a million enemies that are against them because they don't take these ideas with any level of care. And they're just very, very flippant with it. And they just want to take that young man's game of just talking about everybody with all of these ideas that they have. So, and is that fruitful? Is that a good idea? I would say that if you asked these people what their goals were from the ground up, that their goals would not match the outcomes that they're actually manifesting in reality. So that's really just always the question, is being honest about where you want certain things to go. And then how do you actually get that to go? If you actually ask yourself these questions, then the answers will become clear and you won't have any issues in terms of actually enacting your will upon the world.
Yeah, I think one thing you actually highlighted there, which is an excellent point, is all areas aren't just unique with a random set of characters that spawn into that area. Essentially, if you want to have certain kinds of experiences and conversations, go to an area where if you think backwards, the person would have to almost be pre-selected to think similarly. So not only did you say this order, you also pointed out that for certain health things, that's why you go to the gym, because in the gym, there's no lying about moving the piece of metal. Can the person do that? Did they have the capability and nutrition to do that? If so, they must have arrived at some level of objective truth, which in a world filled with lies that doesn't want you to work out in the gym and be healthy, that means they will on some level have had to be iconoclastic and capable of being critical of those structures and concepts. That's why you point out that, like, actually a lot of the gym bros are the ones that, even though the joke is it's the easiest way for the media to then dismiss them, that they're just this muscle-bound junkhead idiot, loghead more like, I guess, with the term, and that they're just, you know, they're only about the physical. They're on some level pre-selected to be more open to ideas that may be true but not politically expedient. No, I agree with you on that. Also, I will just say this. I think you're very right. It's why I always say that comment. I think you can say anything. You just can't say any set of words that you might want. And those aren't the same thing. Like what you just said there, if anyone's ever noticed, I'm told by what I infer on Twitter that I have all these radical, extremist political and social opinions. But then bizarrely, I do all these talk shows where I clearly talk about my life and my philosophy and even allude to events that might normally be third rail topics. And I do them consistently with people who aren't at all from my political sphere as I am perceived. In fact, there's even people that would be perceived to be an enemy of mine. It might shock people that these people do shows with me or appear on my shows. But if you ever go and listen to the conversations, I totally agree. Well, the problem with most political and social topics is people have debate, which in the modern world just means argue, and it's like a PvP zone where you do your build order, he does his build order, and then we see which one wins or which the referee biases the game towards. Whereas I would just say this, I'll give you a really obvious allusion to a social issue. Let's say there was a topic where people had a lot of debate over how we can define our identities and as a result, our social category, maybe even as humans. And normally the political divide would go like, right, well, maybe Thorin's more on the lines of there's a strict divide here, and the other people think actually there's a wide spectrum and anyone can be anything and anywhere they want on it. And actually to express my view seems restrictive and draconian and evil and authoritarian because it does come to certain moral conclusions, whereas theirs is open and loving and accepting and inclusive. And if I was to talk to that person, but I actually wanted to express my ideas or appeal to them, I would never come at them with like political language or sloganing or mocking them. I would say something in that domain like, well, actually, I agree with the principle you've expressed there, that it's very important that people do reflect on who they are and what the realities of their situation are, and they don't live a lie, for example. And I think actually it's really important that we're allowed to be different from each other and that we acknowledge that it can be harmful sometimes when people don't allow. Now, what's funny is if you actually parse what I just said, they would agree with everything I just said right there. But the joke is, if I actually then said it explicitly with all the third rail words in, they'd be horrified by what I just said. They would actually think I was evil, I was totally wrong, and that they would assume we have no shared ground. They would actually assume I'm there for hostile, malevolent reasons to destroy them in some way. And so I often tell people, just think about the really important universal things we all agree upon. And if you want to just throw someone a breadcrumb, do things like start out with what you share before you arrive at a small area of difference. So again, if I was to talk about like the safety of children in some social context, I would actually start out, since I assume this person isn't an evil person intentionally harming children, with the agreed universal principles of, I, like you, don't want children to be harmed or hurt or forced to do things that are not in keeping with their character or their identity. In fact, I think it's really important we safeguard children from people who would want to do that, because I actually think family, and children in some sense are an extended family to us all because they represent the next generation. I think it is really important that we safeguard them in a way much more so than just like social trends or what's popular might seem like. Again, I think I could get the other person on the other side of the imaginary aisle to think like, holy shit, maybe he actually's on my side there, even though the reality is we do have these shared values. I actually think so much of this stuff is just a smokescreen. This is what the psyops often are. Like, the joke is, it's not even usually that like you're ferreting out which the right one is and which one. It's like we said earlier, they take something true or something that has an impetus to it or a reality, and then they shape it so that actually both conclusions you come to often just lead to the goal they want and don't really work for you.
Yeah, so this goes back into the thing that we're talking about and how people get their language from movies. It's in the exact same senses that when people get a position of, the person that would be antagonistic to this person that you're speaking to, all of the language that they're being given, a big part of that is that their language that they are taking on is going to be as antagonistic to their view as possible. Whereas if you can speak the language of the person that you're talking to, use more empathetic, more understanding language, then you can make essentially any point that you want and come to these conclusions and come to these agreements and make it to where even if they understand that you have the position that they would immediately go level 100 screech mode at, even if they understand that you have that position at the end, you could get into a situation where there's absolutely no hostility whatsoever. Yes. And so in that sense, it's about finding out the lenses and the views that people have, and sort of, it's more difficult to talk on the level and talk at the language that somebody else has. But if you want to actually have productive conversations, then you have to be speaking the same language as them.
Yes.
And
but I'll give you a quick thing you've just made me think of. It's even something you see all the time on social media mocked, which is this idea that, I'll give you an example. Obviously, people know one of my pet peeves is the idea of being explicitly woke, and because essentially they don't ever have to avoid the third rail, mate. They're just 24/7 stepping on third rails. It's just they don't know their third rails because currently the regime acknowledges that's not a third rail for them. So one of the reasons why I tend to be bristly against that is because I do actually feel like a lot of those people, when they make all those points, aren't looking at the language they're using. And so the way people online deride them is they make the point, which is totally valid, that like you can essentially just use their language against them in a hostile way. So if someone comes to you and says, well, you're such and such, and that means you must be this way, and therefore like I'm going to call you another thing, you could then say to them all the language they use. Well, hey, my identity and who I am, the reality of my person is very important to my mental health. And actually, you're encroaching upon that by labeling me in that manner and not allowing me to self-identify. And actually, the language you're using is hostile, oppressive, and not inclusive. Now, you could do that, but the problem is you're not actually listening to what they're saying. You're not, you're talking about, you're not trying as you would to use that language to like guide them to a shared truth and avoid the spells, undo the spells even. You're actually using it just to like deride them without realizing, no, actually, the things they're saying are effective because they've packaged what you might consider hostile ideas in language that we all, on some level, have to agree with. That sounds good and feels good.
So, yeah, it's just ultimately finding the people that are on your lines. Don't make enemies. The ways that you want to be discussing things are in certain lights. And then also just kind of have a question of where do you want your life to actually go? And it's always in the question of find some ideal that is exactly how you want to be. If you want to look a certain way, or if you want to be successful in a skill, just look at somebody who is doing it has the outcome that you like, and then try to find ways of dealing with it. Like one topic that is really interesting to us on our sphere is the idea of, how much media do you want to actually expose your children to? Because we obviously always see, like the issues of the iPad kid and the families that worship at the Kingdom of Medea, how that can be obviously very negative. But then we also see families personally that are completely Luddite in that sense. And then when those children go out into the outside world, they don't have any shield, they don't have any defense. And it it makes it to where they can completely rubber band back out of that.
Yes.
So the question is like, all right, how do you actually give your children the defenses for actually being able to deal with these things? And while you, as somebody who is, part of a certain class of modern people, you can't necessarily solve these things on yourself, but you can always solve the things on the next generation. And really just trying to take that lens of, I am going to give my children the best case scenario to where they can enact what is my 10-year plan, what is my 50-year plan, what is my 100-year plan. Because if you want to have your progeny, your community exist and have your fundamental values exist 100 years from now, there are certain steps that you'll be able to take right now, today, within 1 year, within 1 week, within 5 years, that will lead you to that path, lead you to that outcome. And it's the idea of a sailor with no destination has no favorable winds. To where when you have a strong idea of where you want your life to go, then you understand what direction that you need to take in life and what directions will be unfavorable to you. And when you don't have any direction, then there are no favorable winds. There are no unfavorable winds. So in that sense, just really find out what are the things and just truly think about, what is my 100-year plan? And then the chips will fall where they may.
To close the episode, I think it should be obvious at this point in time by the discussion we had that if people would like more of Yasukeh's thoughts on these exact kind of topics, by the way, he has a podcast called the It's Been Real podcast where he discusses this with a character called Starman, who's also a similar type of vibe. And essentially, if people want to go and explore it, you've done how many episodes so far? And is there like overall a concept as to what the show will be? Is it just like you think up a topic and you just go and do that one live? Is it headed in a direction? Essentially, like, I think this is quite a good advert for it. What would people get if they were to tune in?
Yeah, so first couple episodes is a lot. Essentially, every topic that we've talked about in this podcast is a topic that we've explored in, a 1-2 hour podcast in depth on that one specific topic. And we record them in batches because we live in, different parts of the world. So there's another 10 or so episodes to come out that talk about these ideals, talk about these concepts of, how do you family plan? There's this idea that, there's 17-year-olds and there's 30-year-olds. If you're an unmarried single man, you're a 17-year-old. If you're a married man, you're 30 years old. It doesn't matter what your actual age is. So I'm 27. No, I'm a 17-year-old. So in that sense, it's both in terms of how to fundamentally structure your life around these ideals and really just how to set up a good community, how to set up a good marriage, how do you set up a good relationship that you can find, and how to enact both health topics, generalized conspiracy lenses, theology, philosophy, all of these topics that we've talked about here, and anything that you would hear in this general idea. These are all topics that there have been podcasts recorded that will talk about these exact same subjects. So if you want to hear more on any of these things, then we elaborate on them in pretty similar, identical ways within the It's Been Real podcast with Yasukeh and Starman.
This video was kindly supported by So Big It Hurts. Would you like to choose a topic I focus on next? Would you like to ask a question in one of my video AMAs? Perhaps you want teasers to find out who upcoming guests are for my Thorinquiry interview series. Or maybe you'd even like to take part in a private, never to be released conversation between you and me. Well, if so, heed this call to action and join Thor Inside today, where? At the Patreon link in the description box below.